On a stormy Halloween night, a passenger plane begins a routine landing. But what happens is far from routine. Investigators must determine what terrible chain of events brought it down nose first, killing everyone aboard. In the fog, a Canadian commuter plane aborts a landing maneuver. Seconds later, it plows full speed into the woods nearby. Was the accident caused by mechanical failure or a fatal lapse of judgment? The answers are preserved in the indestructible black box, dutifully recording a plane's final maneuvers and the crew's last words. Black boxes help investigators make sense of the fields of destruction. After a crash, a black box is often the only surviving witness to terror. On the evening of October 31st, 1994, American Eagle Flight 4184 took off in the rain from Indianapolis to Chicago, less than 200 miles away. As the twin-engine turboprop approached its destination, air traffic controllers told the crew to expect delays. A fierce storm was backing up traffic outside O'Hare International Airport. The plane was put in a holding pattern over a rural section of northeast Indiana. The pilots noticed some icing and activated equipment to crack it off the wings. They depended on the autopilot to keep the plane steady and to maintain altitude. Attendants tried to reassure passengers that they would make their connections. All the other flights were delayed too. One of the busiest airports in the world was at a total standstill. In an announcement reconstructed from transcripts, the captain tried to reassure the restless passengers.
Well, folks, once again, this is the captain. I do regret to inform you that air traffic control is saying at this point another 13 minutes. We'll be sure to keep you updated. I do apologize.
The plane had been holding for more than 30 minutes. Because of the storm, some passengers had debated whether to board the flight. Now they grew increasingly anxious. Finally, the transcripts indicated that controllers cleared Flight 4184 to begin landing procedures.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
And then 8,000, Eagle Flight 184.
Eagle Flight 184, should be about 10 minutes until you're cleared in.
Thank you.
It was the last communication Flight 4184 would have with controllers. As the plane began its descent, something went terribly wrong. Instead of leveling off at 8,000 feet, the plane continued to descend, picking up speed. It plummeted through 7,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 5,000 feet. At 4,000 feet, it vanished from the radar screen. The aircraft plunged into a muddy soybean field in rural Indiana, shattering on impact. Fighting driving rain and freezing temperatures, rescue workers searched through the night for any sign of life from the 72 passengers and crew. Finally, they faced the truth. No one survived. When an airplane crashes in the United States, it's up to the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, to determine what went wrong. Greg Feith was the lead investigator in the case of Flight 4184.
When I go out to an accident site, I'm playing Dick Tracy. My job is to go out and find all the evidence, all the clues that tell us what happened.
The public demands answers and looks to the NTSB to provide them, fast. So agents are brought in quickly. They are often among the first to witness the devastation.
It can be very overwhelming I mean, it's an emotional thing, because when you're walking through all of this wreckage, you're seeing pictures, you're seeing teddy bears, you're seeing clothing of children and things like that. So you can't help but start to become emotionally attached. But as an investigator, in order for me to remain objective, you have to separate your emotion out of that, and you got to block it out so that you can do your job and do it effectively. And that's not always easy for us.
As the sun rose the next morning, it revealed the true horror of the accident. Impact craters marred the once peaceful farm, transforming it to a field of death. The narrow country roads of Roselawn, Indiana, bustled with truckloads of rescue equipment and the clamor of news crews. A team of forensic aviation experts from the NTSB arrived. Their job was to create order from the growing chaos, so they could focus on the difficult task of figuring out what happened.
Immediately, what our investigator and the team will do is actually what we call document the four corners. We want to look for all of the wreckage. We want to make sure that both wings are there, the tail section is there, the engines are there.
But the investigation was hampered by health risks. Fuel covered everything. The site was declared a biohazard. Only those in safety gear went in and out. Rescue workers and investigators teamed up to flag evidence and remains. They worked side by side, examining every piece. As soon as possible, parts of bodies were transported to the morgue to begin the difficult identification process.
For us, the investigators, we're looking at physical evidence of the airplane, that is, the wreckage itself. For the coroner, who has to go out there and look for the bodies or the victims, they had as tough a time as we did because they didn't have whole people. They had fragments of people. And so for both of us to do our job, we had to work hand in hand, because if I found a piece of wreckage, there may have been critical evidence for the coroner in a piece of a victim. And so we worked hand in hand when we were looking at all of this wreckage so that I could help him collect whatever evidence he needed to identify the people that were on that airplane.
As bodies were identified, they were released for burial. Family members found solace in each other and in the chaplains and counselors who volunteered to help. But in the midst of family sorrow, investigators kept working. They scoured the soybean field for answers. To figure out how the plane broke up, they viewed the wreckage from above. They examined the scars in the earth created by the impact and the locations of the scattered pieces of airplane. The patterns can tell them if a piece broke off on impact or if it fell off during flight, causing the accident. What they found in the ruins of Flight 4184 was startling.
Typically, when you have an airplane that's either come straight down or made an emergency type landing, you'll find the initial impact point and then wreckage in a V-tail or fan-shaped pattern. With this particular accident site, we had a very high-speed, high angle of attack impact into the ground, so we had a main impact crater, but we found the tail section in a very oddball place in relation to the main impact crater. That led to the team to think, how did that get there? And it was evident that it was an in-flight breakup, so the tail had come off before the airplane hit the ground.
Now, investigators had a possible explanation. A structural failure may have caused the tail to break off in flight. But airplane tails don't just break off. Something must have triggered the failure. More evidence needed to be examined, more data gathered. The weather that night provided the first clue. The conditions were ideal for icing. To many, the freezing rain in which the plane was flying could have been a major factor. But it seemed unlikely that icing on the wings could cause the tail to fracture. The only way to determine what really happened would be to look inside the plane's black box. A black box is actually two boxes, and they're not black, they're orange, making them easier to find. One contains a record of the plane's mechanical workings. It's called the flight data recorder. The other is the cockpit voice recorder. Basically a crash-proof tape recorder, it contains an account of everything the pilots say. It also picks up alarms, engine noise, and perhaps the horrifying sound of impact. Within hours, the boxes were whisked away to NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C. There, technicians prepared them for analysis. Sometimes black boxes provide instant answers. Other times, they only deepen the mystery. As investigators prepared the playback equipment, they also prepared themselves. They'd be the first to hear what the pilots said as they faced death head-on. After maintaining a holding pattern near O'Hare Airport, Flight 4184 was cleared to descend from 10,000 feet. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the earth, killing everyone aboard. Now, investigators would listen to the cockpit voice recorder as the plane began its fatal plunge. The crew's words during the terrifying last moments are taken from transcripts.
I knew we'd do that. I'm trying to keep it at 180. All right. Okay, just mellow out. Okay. Low. Here.
The chilling tape made it clear the pilots were completely broadsided. They didn't know they were in trouble until it was too late. But it raised more questions than it answered. Investigators were no closer to learning what happened. Their last hope lay inside the second box, the Flight Data Recorder, or FDR. Now, all the plane's mechanical functions, or malfunctions, would be analyzed. Doug Brazee is a black box expert at NTSB. He's responsible for turning the complicated bits of data from FDRs into useful information. The data recorded by an FDR depends on the age and type of plane it's in. The one on Flight 4184 monitored about 100 mechanical functions. Brazee downloaded the information to a computer using tape decks that translate the coded data. The information appears as charts and graphs on the computer. They represent the pilot's actions and the airplane's performance in the final minutes before it plunged to Earth. The readouts were placed side by side on a timeline to see their relationships. As the data appeared, Brazee discovered the plane had experienced an abrupt, catastrophic event. To get a better understanding, he created an animated version of the plane's last moments.
It's very difficult to get a sense of time and how quickly or slowly things can unfold from looking at numbers and graphs. The animation helps us see how quickly or how slowly things develop in the accident sequence.
The animation combines all the plane's functions just before it fell into a visual model that investigators can study. It began as the plane started its descent from 10,000 feet. Without warning, the autopilot disengaged. The ailerons, flaps on the wings that control flight, suddenly flipped. The plane rolled violently to the right. The pilots grabbed the controls and struggled to level out, but the speed of the roll was too great. It yanked the controls out of their hands and the nose dived toward Earth. As they burst through the clouds, the ground filled their windshield, rushing toward them at 400 miles per hour. Futilely, the pilots pulled back on the controls to bring up the nose. The resulting strain on the tail was too great. It snapped off just before the plane hit the ground. The animation made the sequence of events tragically clear.
The airplane was in flight. When the airplane rolled, it initially rolled to approximately 77 degrees the first time, and the nose started to pitch down. The first officer was able to recover it slightly, and as he tried to pull the nose back up, the airplane then rolled again completely through 360 degrees. The nose pitched down, and the roll continued another approximately 140 degrees until the first officer was able to get the roll stopped. But because of the very steep attitude that the airplane was in, and as he tried to pull out, he had a lot of aerodynamic force on the tail section of the airplane because he was pulling extreme. He was actually moving these flight control surfaces to their maximum. High aerodynamic loads, this part of the airplane literally came off, and the airplane then basically went over on its nose, striking the ground and then fragmenting. And as it fragmented, this part of the aircraft ended up getting slingshotted to the furthest point in the wreckage area.
It was now evident that the crash wasn't caused by the tail breaking off in flight. That left icing as the probable cause. But Brazy knew icing would normally show up on the screen as a slow, steady buildup, not a sudden cataclysm. What could have overpowered the plane so quickly and sent it careening to Earth? Knowing what makes a plane fly can provide clues to how it can fall. At Embry-Riddle University in Prescott, Arizona, wind tunnels are used to demonstrate the aerodynamics of flight. Here, the invisible forces of wind are made to glow, unveiling the basic principle of flight. The faster that air moves over a surface, the less pressure it exerts. The slower moving air underneath pushes upward, causing the surface to lift. Aerospace engineer Richard Felton demonstrates the principle with a simple experiment.
Let me demonstrate with a sheet of paper, if I might. I'm going to blow over the top of this surface of paper, so I'm not going to create anything below. There's no magic here at all, okay? And as you can see, the paper actually raises.
Wings are not flat like paper, but they work the same way. The air moves faster across the round top of the wing because it has more surface to cover. But it's critical that the top surface be smooth and that nothing on it disrupts the flow of air. If the airflow is disturbed, the object loses the pressure that lifts it. Any foreign objects on the wings can disrupt the airflow. For instance, ice can build up, then break off, leaving jagged edges. That may produce enough turbulence to bring down a plane. Flight 4184 was an ATR-72 series airplane. Roselawn investigators discovered that these planes had a history of icing problems. But the FDR showed that its de-icing system was working properly, and the readout didn't show normal icing patterns. Then, investigators learned of a weather phenomenon called supercooled drizzle drops, extra large freezing rain. A check with meteorologists told them the conditions that stormy Halloween night were right for this phenomenon to occur. Was weather the fatal factor? To find out, the manufacturer of the ATR took to the skies over the Mojave Desert in California. There, they tried to recreate the exact conditions of the storm. In an experiment called a tanker test, a modified U.S. Air Force jet produced an icing cloud 8 feet wide. An ATR, like the one at Roselawn, flew into the cloud. The freezing rain clouds were infused with yellow dye, so investigators could see the ice forming on the nose and wings. To make sure the tragedy was not repeated, test pilots flew very high for added recovery time and were prepared to eject if necessary. At first, normal freezing rain was released. The small water droplets froze the instant they hit the front of the wings, but the de-icing boots cracked the ice off. Then, a cloud of supercooled drizzle drops was released. When the drops hit the wings, they didn't freeze instantly. Instead, they spread across the wing, freezing behind and out of reach of the de-icing boots. At last, the final piece of the puzzle was put in place.
Typically, when the wing has no contamination on it, these bands or relative wind are smooth flowing over the top and the bottom of the airfoil. But with the Roselawn accident, when we had the ridge of ice, which is represented by this triangle, we have now disrupted that airflow. As the airflow then reattached or came back across the very top of the wing, it got very turbulent as it came off the trailing edge, which is represented by this area right here. That turbulence was right over the top of the ailerons. And when the turbulence created a very low pressure system, this aileron started to move from like a neutral position up to its maximum deflection of 14 degrees in a quarter of a second.
Now, investigators concluded what happened that night and why. The pilots were in the holding pattern. They were chatting. The autopilot was on. They thought everything was fine. What they didn't know was that behind the de-icing equipment, a ridge of ice was building up. As they started to descend, the ice cracked off. What remained left ragged edges on the wing, causing turbulent airflow. The turbulence created a powerful low-pressure system that acted like a vacuum. It literally sucked the ailerons up, forcing the plane into a roll. Attempts to right the plane only snapped the tail. The plane then dove into the earth. Afterward, all was silent except for the driving rain. And then, silence. The crater in a soybean field in Roselawn, Indiana, is a scar that can never be healed. But by solving the accident, investigators had done all they could. After the investigation, the ATR's de-icing system was redesigned, extending farther back on the wing, and ATR pilots are now trained for icing conditions. The work of the NTSB and others on the Roselawn case helped to reduce the chances of a similar accident happening again. Every airplane crash is the result of a fatal mixture of conditions. The ingredients come from the plane, the weather, and the pilot himself. In Canada, investigators tried to reconstruct a commuter plane's recipe for disaster. The mountains of British Columbia are among the most breathtaking in North America. But for pilots flying through them, they can be treacherous. In 1989, 2 young pilots at Skylink Airlines were flying 5 commuters in a 19-seat turboprop from Vancouver to Terrace, just over 400 miles away. They'd made the trip dozens of times, and they were familiar with the dense morning fog that often drifts through this part of Western Canada. The morning of September 26th was the start of just another day. Shortly before Flight 70 made its final approach to the runway, a 300-foot fog bank engulfed the airport, bringing visibility to 0. The pilot expected to see the runway lights pierce the fog at any moment. Instead, he saw only gloom. As the plane swooped down for the landing, he had second thoughts and safely aborted the maneuver. But as he pulled away, treetops suddenly loomed large through the dense haze. The airplane plowed through the branches, rolled, and burst into flames. The pilots and passengers were killed on impact. Investigators from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada were assigned the horrible task of making sense of the tangled wreckage. Trees had cracked and fallen onto the fuselage. One of the wings had sheared off. The cabin was crushed. The cockpit was peeled open, exposing a snarled mass of wires, cables, and circuitry. The force had twisted and snapped off the propellers. It took days to find pieces of aircraft that hurtled into the forest. Reading the wreckage would take even longer. It's a forensic skill that requires intensive training. At Embry-Riddle University, would-be investigators gain experience by studying the remains of actual crashes reconstructed on the site. Director of Aerospace Safety, Bill Waldock, instructs his students in what to look for and how to find it.
Well, just like in a crime scene, what I want the students to be able to do is to identify all of the things about this scene that are significant, to be able to find all of the parts, to be able to understand how those parts got where they were and what they mean, and then to be able to take that and put it into the rest of the story and literally fit all the pieces of the puzzle back together and come up with a clear picture of what happened to this aircraft and why it happened.
According to Waldock, finding out what caused a crash is the first step to preventing another one.
The main purpose we do investigations is to try to figure out what happened and why it happened, and once we've done that, then we can go change things and try to improve the rest of the system. It's an expensive way to learn, but usually it's one of the most impressive ways to learn, and we can get the point across pretty well that way.
Every detail of the wrecks is painstakingly duplicated, right down to the flames. If a crash site is on fire, it's crucial to determine if the flames started in the air or on the ground. A plane that burns then crashes shows a different pattern than a plane that crashes then burns. A fire that ignites during flight generally burns hotter than a fire caused by impact because it's fanned by the rushing wind. According to Waldock, pre-impact fires leave a distinctive signature.
One of the things that we look for in considering pre-impact fire versus post-impact fire is evidence that metal was hot when it hit the ground. And right in this area of the engine compartment on the left side, you see a little bit of feathered aluminum. To get that aluminum to broom straw or feather, that metal has to be up near its melting point. And right here we see a little bit of evidence that that process has occurred. That tells us that we had a pre-impact fire in this left engine compartment.
Less than 7% of fires occur on impact. But when they do, they make the investigators' work much more difficult. When rescue crews put out the flames, the force of spraying water moves parts a considerable distance, and the fire itself can destroy valuable evidence.
Fire will tend to get rid of our physical evidence. We're looking for example, fatigue in a metal structure. If the airplane caught on fire when it hit the ground, it'll tend to erase that evidence, tend to burn it away. And fire is one of the worst things we can do.
At the crash site in Canada, fire was only the first of the many challenges investigators would face. Burn patterns showed that the fire was the result of the impact, not the cause of it. Lead investigator Roger Ayotte recalls the scene.
The aircraft had crashed some 1,500 feet away from the airport, and the actual crash site itself was not particularly large. The airplane had hit the ground at fairly high speed, and the destruction was considerable. It certainly wasn't evident when we went onto the accident site what the problem had been. When we did start examining the wreckage, we realized that the aircraft, in fact, had impacted the ground inverted because the engine positions were switched on the ground.
Ayotte and his team reasoned the fog may have played a role, but only a minor one. The pilots were too experienced, the collision too fast and furious, the devastation too complete. In the charred rubble, investigators located the flight's black boxes, still bolted to the tail. Their bright orange exteriors were camouflaged with soot. Perhaps the boxes would reveal what happened. They were flown to Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Ottawa for analysis. In the lab, black box expert Michael Poole and computer analyst Bob Hoyle were stunned by what they found. The flight data recorder should have been an electronic device that captured most of the plane's mechanical functions on magnetic tape or microchip. Instead, It was an unauthorized and antiquated model, invented in 1951. Its use had been prohibited in many countries. Rather than electronic circuitry, the box used a stylus to etch information onto a moving roll of foil.
Okay, the flight data recorder on this aircraft was an old design. It was a foil type recorder, which is a metal foil, which 5 parameters are inscribed on the foil. And of those 5, heading, which is a key parameter, was actually not functioning. So we in fact only had 4 parameters. And in contrast with today's modern aircraft, which have 500-600 parameters per second, obviously there's a very big difference here. So we had a very limited flight data recorder. The data on that recorder is also, the resolution is very poor, and it's extremely time-consuming to extract the information off of these foil type recorders.
In its time, the foil recorder was a technological advance because it could survive impact and fire. Now, its primitive workings threatened to cripple the investigation. To eke out some meaning from the foil scratchings, Hoyle scanned them into a computer. Perhaps modern technology would give its predecessor a helping hand. Hoyle was able to sharpen and focus the information from the coarse etchings enough to interpret them. The FDR showed that the plane flew an unwavering course into the trees at more than 200 miles per hour. But one mark indicated something strange, a sudden burst of speed just before the plane struck. The information was incomplete and contradictory. Why would a plane, in the midst of an aborted landing, suddenly plunge into the ground? Poole and his colleagues turned to the cockpit voice recorder for an explanation. They found only more contradictions. The pilot told the co-pilot they were going to abort the landing, go around and try again. On the tape, in the background, the engines roared to full power. That was consistent with a climb. But it wasn't consistent with the disturbing final exchange between the pilot and co-pilot. Transcripts indicate the co-pilot began to warn that the plane was losing altitude.
Descending. Okay. Descending.
Well, when we first listened to the voice recorder, it was quite perplexing because the crew had initiated a missed approach. They were starting to do a go-around. We could hear engine power coming up. They were asking for gear up. They were asking for flaps up. They were starting to climb out, and for some reason the airplane transitioned from a climb out to a descent and crashed very quickly. So this was quite puzzling, and that was really where we started to focus. Why was this airplane, which should have been able to fly out, shouldn't have been a big problem, transitioning from an ascent to a descent and hitting the ground?
The black boxes yielded only vague clues. They held none of the hard data Poole had come to expect from them. He relayed the bad news to fellow investigators. The gaps left by the primitive data recorder would have to be filled in manually. A team of nearly a dozen forensic aviation specialists would have to engage in hardcore, old-fashioned detective work. Fortunately, they had an arsenal of sophisticated tools to help them. The first step was to determine if the damaged engine was the cause of the crash or the result of it. For that, investigators depended on engineering services specialist John Garstang.
As part of the crash site investigation, we saw that the right engine was extensively damaged and disintegrated. In order to understand this damage, whether it occurred in flight or it occurred in the ground as a result of ground impact, we had to know how the aircraft broke up. That's where we used tree information together with the attitude that it hit the ground to determine the breakup sequence.
Garstang specializes in coaxing clues from places investigators can't go, like the tops of the trees. He mounted a stereoscopic camera on a helicopter and shot 3D photos of the damaged trees. He used these photos to determine the angle at which the plane struck the forest.
This is the crash site. The red dots are pieces of wreckage. The aircraft initially descended through the forest starting here. All the black dots are trees that have been damaged, most of which had been cut by the aircraft.
He then created a model showing the path of the plane as it plowed through the trees. It showed the plane was level as it clipped the treetops. Both engines must have been in place, keeping the plane balanced. The roll didn't occur until after it hit the trees. Garstang concluded the engines were attached on impact. Now he had to see if they were working properly. Erratic moves in the final flight path of the plane might hint at an engine problem. But because the FDR didn't have the data Garstang needed, he had to devise a clever way to reconstruct the plane's movements. He made a map showing the locations of witnesses when they heard the plane.
We used the location of witnesses on the ground, and through triangulating from where they are to where they either saw the aircraft or heard it, we were able to determine that the general flight path was in an arc like this that approached towards the airport in this direction, and then ultimately the plane crashed over here.
Witnesses determined the flight showed no sign of trouble, and they provided Garstang with other useful information.
Initially, we heard that the witnesses heard noises or sounds like a wowing change in pitch that made us wonder whether there was possibly an engine problem or a propeller problem. And at the crash site, we were missing pieces, and there's an extensive damage done to the right engine that initially led us to try and focus in that area to see if that was an area of concern.
Engine trouble is often the cause of small plane crashes. To see if it was behind this accident, Chief Analyst Bill Taylor dissected the battered engines.
When we're doing an engine investigation and doing a teardown, there are 2 or 3 things that we're looking for. First of all, we want to see whether there's been a mechanical failure in the engine. That's most apparent, most obvious, and the easiest thing to do. The second is to look for evidence of the power level. That's very helpful in an accident investigation to discover whether the engine was producing full power. It may be running, but running at low level, at idle, as you might say. It gives an indication, again, of what was available to the crew at that time.
If the engine was at full power when it crashed, it would bear the scars of its moving parts as they struck the engine body. Deep markings indicated the engines were at high power. The large amount of dirt and debris sucked into it on impact confirmed that finding. Taylor gave the engines a clean bill of health. He determined the wowing sounds heard by witnesses were normal engine sounds bouncing off the uneven terrain. He'd have to look elsewhere for answers. He checked the landing gear. It too was working. It was nearly retracted at the time of the crash, consistent with the procedure for an aborted landing. So far, the plane seemed in perfect working order. No clues had surfaced. Investigators were stymied. But was it possible something was driving the pilot to land quickly and take risks? Could he have been running out of fuel? John Garstang used infrared photography to find out.
What we have here on the left is a conventional color photograph of the forest, and on the right is what's referred to as a near-infrared photograph.
In conventional photography, fuel blends into the natural shadow. But shot with near-infrared film, the spray of fuel appears as a dark stain.
Records like the weight and balance gave us a good indication of what the fuel quantity should be, and we used the infrared imagery to confirm that there was sufficient quantity or a large quantity of fuel present. We have the ground scar here left by the right wing, and you can see a general area of discoloration where the fuel has been sprayed, as well as there's been a ground fire and branches have been broken.
The photographs revealed the plane arrived at the airport with fuel to spare. Another dead end for the investigators. According to all indications, Flight 70 should never have crashed. But it did. And until investigators figured out why, the tragedy could recur. The nagging question remained. After aborting the landing, why would the pilot start to climb and then dive into the earth? Engineer Jim Foots checked the accuracy of the aircraft's instruments. Perhaps they were lying.
Well, we look at the instruments, and which leads to looking at the dial faces and in the internal mechanisms of the instruments, because again, not all FDRs record all parameters. So we can look at the instruments and at times get information from the dial face, such as pointer slaps, gear train damage, and they will tell us what that actual system was doing at impact.
If the impact was severe enough, the pointer would slap against the dial face and leave a mark. Even if the pointer was lost, the telltale mark would remain. Most of the instruments were destroyed beyond recognition. Only the altimeter survived, and it showed the plane's altitude setting was right where it should have been. The pilot should have known how close to the ground he was. Once again, the solution remained elusive. But Foots had his suspicions. If the plane was going down, a warning system should have alerted the pilot, unless the warning system itself was faulty. He directed his attention to the warning lights. Light bulb filaments can tell a great deal about conditions at the moment a plane crashes.
Well, we do light bulb analysis even if the aircraft does have an FDR or CVR. If the FDR gives us an indication that there was a problem, a warning, then we can look at the light bulbs and actually say, yeah, this light was on, and that the pilot did have a warning or a caution light.
A bulb that's lit when it's broken reacts very differently than a bulb that's off. It's easy for the trained eye to spot the difference.
What we're looking at here is the filaments. And what we look for with the filaments is deformation, as you see here, total uncoiling of the filament, which is indicative of a hot or illuminated filament when impacted, as opposed to a lamp that was off or cold at impact, where we have just a straight brittle fracture.
Foots found that none of the 37 surviving warning bulbs from Flight 70 had been on. But that didn't necessarily mean all was well with the craft. Still searching for clues, investigators focused again on the position of the aircraft. While attempting to abort the landing, perhaps the plane's nose tilted too high. At a steep angle, air can't glide easily over the wings. The plane stalls and drops from the sky. In order to figure out if Flight 70 stalled, investigators would have to climb into the pilot's seat. Whatever happened to Skylink Flight 70 came without warning. Now investigators had to reconstruct the tragedy. The stall avoidance system on this type of aircraft was notoriously unforgiving. It provided very little notice to the pilot before a stall. At low altitude, the difference between stall and crash and life and death is mere seconds. To see if the plane's pitch or angle in the air would cause a stall, investigators needed to reconstruct its final moments. For that, they needed a flight simulator. They fed in all the data they collected, along with pilot commands from the voice recorder. The simulator would combine these disconnected clues into a close estimate of the plane's position.
We knew what the altitude and airspeed of the aircraft was at the start of the missed approach. We also knew when they added the power, when they retracted the landing gear, and when they retracted the flaps. So we were able to come into the simulator and use those parameters that were available off the flight data recorder and fly the airplane in accordance with those parameters, and then through that process determine what the pitch attitude of the aircraft was.
If the pitch was too steep, the plane would have stalled, then crashed. But that wasn't what happened. The simulator showed the plane's pitch was fine. Stalling, and a faulty stall avoidance system were ruled out. After a tireless examination of the plane from nose to tail, investigators could finally rule out mechanical failure. They had only one more place to find answers, with the man in the cockpit. To determine if human error was at fault, Roger Ayotte needed to get inside the pilot's head.
Once we had eliminated the possibility of mechanical malfunction of the aircraft, and that was probably a couple of months into the investigation, then we were able to focus all of our efforts on the operational and human performance sides of the accident.
While one type of investigator searches for physical clues, another looks for psychological ones. Black box expert Mike Poole created a voice print, turning emotion into a picture. And human performance investigators Ron Coleman and Beth McCullough were brought in to study it. To explore what was going on in the minds of the pilots, they scrutinized their final words.
Descending. Okay. Descending.
So his first response
First one's casual.
is,
Yes.
Okay, no big deal, but
The second one's got a lot of anxiety in it.
When the co-pilot alerted the pilot they were descending, the pilot answered calmly with a simple okay. McCullough felt there was far more going on than the first playback led them to believe.
But if you've got someone next to you who's obviously expressing concern and in a rather agitated voice, then you begin to wonder, and that might be your first question, is this captain being really calm about the situation, has it fully under control, or is he unaware of the gravity of the situation?
Descending. Okay. Descending.
First thing that we picked up was the anxiety in the co-pilot's voice when he uttered the second descending. After that, we went back, listened to the entire tape many, many times to try and determine the various operational issues that might have emerged or did emerge, and also some of the human performance issues that were clear just from listening to the voices and the pauses and the hesitation.
From the voice recording, Coleman and McCullough surmised that the pilot sounded unconcerned, oblivious to the fact that he was speeding towards certain death. They ruled out suicide. Psychological profiles were normal. The investigation team suspected the pilot was literally lost in the clouds. He didn't know which way was up. And he wasn't trusting his instruments or his co-pilot to set him straight. Did pilot error cause the crash? The team was close to figuring it out. But before they could, more testing was necessary. Was the pilot of Flight 70 truly disoriented in the fog? To illustrate what he might have experienced, Mike Poole collated the data and produced an animated version of the fatal flight. Next to it, he created an illusion plane. It was based on what the human performance experts believe the pilot may have perceived.
columnist approach, he asks for the gear to come up, the gear is selected up, he calls for the flaps to come up, and the first officer has responded with flaps coming up to half.
Shrouded by fog, unable to see the runway, the pilot searches for visual clues outside his window. In his efforts to get his bearings, he fails to notice his gauges or to heed his co-pilot's concern.
What we know, and from our operational investigators suspect, that he is maybe adjusting the throttles in the cockpit, he's maybe unfamiliar with his flight director, he's in fog, he's perhaps a little bit lost in respect to where exactly is the runway, is it to my right, is it to my left? So all these factors can be distracting him from that task of watching those instruments.
The animation showed that the pilot did indeed confuse up with down. The condition is called somatographic illusion. It occurs when pilots are deprived of visual cues. Instead, they rely on gut instinct.
Basically, the human body cannot distinguish the difference between a force through your stomach pushing against the back of your chair due to thrust, due to being accelerated down a runway, for example, or the same force due to pitching you up and feeling the effects of gravity pushing you back in the chair.
Though the pilot may have been operating under an illusion, the consequences of his actions were dreadfully real. Investigators went back to the simulator to experience for themselves Flight 70's fatal illusion. A simulator is an excellent place to perform a test for illusions because it's a machine that's been built to trick the eye and mind.
In a simulator, you're in a building, and obviously it can't accelerate you down a runway. But it wants to make you feel that. So to achieve that, what they do is they tilt you back in your chair, and you feel the force of gravity in your chair, and then they fool your visual senses by taking the horizon. Instead of you would normally see it rise, they actually keep it level. So your eyes think the horizon's level, you're feeling this force through your stomach into the back of the chair. That is the sensation of accelerating down the runway, and that essentially is the somatographic illusion.
Roger Ayotte took the mock fatal flight. All the data were entered and the horizon taken away so he could feel the sensation as the pilot had. But he'd fly under instrument flight rules, or IFR, relying totally on his gauges so he would know where the plane was relative to the ground.
Okay, and this is the same approach being conducted in IFR conditions. So you have to concentrate totally on your instruments, and as you can see, you have no visual references outside the cockpit.
With his view blocked, he couldn't tell if he was going up or down while accelerating, but the gauges told him he was heading toward the ground. The simulated flight proved that the pilot had fallen victim to the illusion.
You can fly by the seat of your pants to a certain extent when you're in visual flight conditions, and that is done frequently. However, when you're in instrument flight conditions, so when you're flying in fog or cloud or something like that, then you don't have those visual senses that you do when you're flying visually.
The forces of motion in 3 dimensions can play tricks on the mind. The inner ear regulates balance and lets us know where we stand, but it needs a visual reference. It's extremely difficult to overpower the human instinct to rely on vision when flying. But through sheer willpower, a pilot can stay true to the instruments until his mind overcomes his body. Unfortunately, the pilot of Flight 70 wasn't aware of the danger. It takes a network of complex systems to keep a plane in the air. It also takes a tangle of circumstances to send one crashing down. In both Roselawn, Indiana, and Terrace, British Columbia, a combination of factors conspired against the aircraft, dooming the passengers and crew. But aboard the planes were the black boxes. These indestructible witnesses, coupled with human ingenuity, determined what went wrong. By surviving a crash, black boxes enable us to prevent countless others.
Becky!
Investigators find a clue they think will lead to a killer's front door, but instead find themselves heading down a blind alley. Now their most important evidence is withering before their eyes. When a man reports his wife missing, her abandoned car becomes the biggest clue, but it's the nosy neighbors who drive the investigation. 4 months into her marriage, a woman disappears, but when her body turns up, it's clear she was no runaway bride. Investigators must rely on flimsy evidence to bag her killer. For some lovers, marriage can be murder. Even though proving it may pose a challenge, killers can't divorce themselves from the consequences of their broken vows. In the early morning hours of December 28, 1995, Melinda and David McLean let themselves into the apartment of their sister-in-law, Becky Vargas. The telephone and electricity in her unit hadn't been switched on yet. Becky was separating from her husband and had just rented the Ogden, Utah apartment.
Becky?
She had told her husband, Stephen Vargas, that she was going to try to start organizing her belongings and would return in an hour or two. But that was several hours ago. Stephen had asked Melinda and David to check on her, since they lived nearby. Melinda, who was Stephen's sister and Becky's best friend, was glad to go. Though they didn't see Becky, all seemed quiet and safe, leaving them unprepared for what they found. Becky Vargas lay dead in the leaves outside the building. Even before the sun was up, the Weber County, Utah Crime Scene Investigation Unit began its day processing the murder scene. The victim's blouse had been pulled up. At first glance, the condition of her clothes made her appear to be the victim of a random sexual homicide. But a closer look revealed the story was not so simple. Criminalist Russ Dean thought the scene might have been staged.
It was as if her body had been moved from one location to another. Her arm was under her body as if she'd been dragged. Her coat was removed and was under her body. The leaves were bunched up in certain locations around her arms and legs. And there was no other obvious indication of any type of sexual assault.
In fact, though the victim had suffered a head injury, most of the blood had pooled at her feet, suggesting she'd been turned around. Whoever did this had apparently tried to throw off the investigators. The forensics team documented and collected a set of car keys, a cigarette lighter, fragments of blood-spattered leaves, and most significantly, the apparent murder weapon, a broken flashlight stained with blood and entangled with hair. They spent 6 hours sifting through every inch of the area before they were satisfied. They determined that although the body had been repositioned, the victim hadn't been moved far. The only blood found was just a few inches from where she lay. Because the blood-stained flashlight was the most compelling clue, it was analyzed first at the Utah State Crime Lab in Salt Lake City. Investigators could see that it had a partial fingerprint on it, stamped in blood. According to latent print examiner Scott Spute, a bloody fingerprint can be even better than a smoking gun.
When we have a bloody fingerprint, for example, it's the victim's blood, it's not her finger, it's someone else's finger on the evidence. It's a crucial pinpointing item of evidence in which we can identify someone being at that crime scene, leaving that bloody fingerprint behind at the scene as they left.
It would be bad practice to home in on that one print. The lab had to inspect the flashlight for additional prints, the obvious ones and the ones that remained invisible. It required two separate processes. Bloodstains, because they're not oily, can flake or rub off. To fix them in place, the flashlight was heated to 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes.
After I heat it on, I then put a stain on there which is called amido black, which reacts to the blood and makes it very visible and oftentimes brings out areas of blood that were invisible prior to treatment.
To develop the latent or unseen prints, the flashlight was exposed to superglue vapor. The adhesive bonds to the moisture on the print, creating a durable shell that exposes and preserves it. Then, a fluorescent dye is applied, which adheres to the superglue. The latent prints shine under ultraviolet light. Testing revealed no other blood-stained prints. The original one, along with the latent prints, would have to do. Once a suspect was isolated, investigators were confident that the bloody fingerprint was all they'd need. While the clues were being scrutinized, Melinda McLean and her husband David went to the police station to give their statements. Melinda told police that she'd been best friends with Becky Vargas for 14 years.
And then we went back.
Becky had been married to her brother, Stephen Vargas, for 9 of them, but it looked like their marriage was coming to an end. As far as she knew, the split was amicable.
But, you know, he's trying to work things out. Okay, no, I have a joke for you, okay? There's a screw up.
Though Becky was having an affair that her husband, Stephen Vargas, may have suspected, there didn't seem to be a lot of tension between the couple. In fact, it was Stephen who had called the McLeans to look in on her after the police told him they had no officers available to check on his wife. David McLean, down the hall, told police a similar story. He said that Stephen Vargas had called him just before 11 p.m. the night before the murder.
Did Steve at all go over there?
Stephen was worried because she was away so long, and the apartment had no lights. He said that he and Melinda stopped by. Though Becky's car was in the driveway, there was no answer. They went to a window to see if everything was okay, but stopped when they heard moaning.
Yeah, she sounds busy.
They thought that perhaps her boyfriend was there, so they left. They went to a payphone to tell Stephen that everything was fine. They told him what they had heard, then they left.
Your wife said that you've been seeing a guy.
David told police that out of curiosity, they drove back to Becky's a short time later. Now they were surprised to see Stephen Vargas's Jeep parked out front. Soon he appeared from beside the building, got into the vehicle, and drove off. David said that they caught up with him. Stephen was wearing his bathrobe and slippers. He told them he wanted to check on Becky himself, but asked the McLeans not to tell anyone he was there. When David revealed this detail to the police, Melinda reluctantly admitted it was true. David told police that Stephen called them once more early the following morning. He said that Becky still wasn't home and asked them to check on her again. That's when they found her dead. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the lantern found at the scene wasn't the actual murder weapon, but it may have been used to subdue the victim. From the shape of the wound, she was apparently struck down with a hammer or something similar. No such object was located. The killer was clever enough to carry off or remove some of the most incriminating evidence. Authorities hoped he'd left enough behind. At the police station, investigators continued to talk with the McLeans. Their detailed story seemed to pivot on Stephen Vargas. Then it took a more provocative twist when the police dispatcher told Detective David Wheeloth that Vargas was on the phone, but he wasn't calling about his wife.
She said that he was on the phone inquiring about his sister and his brother-in-law, and if they were in fact at the police station. And I told the dispatcher, yeah, that's who we're in here talking to, and if she would ask him if he would mind coming down to the police station as well.
For your separation.
Police told him about Becky's murder and said that his in-laws were fine, but he might not be because Melinda and David saw him at the murder scene. He admitted that he was there that night, just as the McLeans had said. He peeked in the window, but he heard and saw nothing. Because the window was right next to where the victim was found, Wheeloth didn't believe him.
If Steve had gone there to look and listen, I don't think it would have been likely that he would have not seen Becky lying just a few feet away.
His suspicious behavior and the eyewitness testimony by the McLeans was enough to get a warrant to search Stephen Vargas's Jeep and to collect his fingerprints and a blood sample.
Can you get a paper bag?
Investigators were after anything that could link him to the crime scene. They found nothing but minuscule fragments of leaves, and not even many of those.
Actually, I wish I could find my little...
The Jeep looked recently vacuumed. They collected what they could, then returned the vehicle to Vargas and sent him home. The forensics team hoped they wouldn't need to rely on the leaves. Now that they had Vargas's fingerprint, they could compare it to the ones from the flashlight. Most of the prints did, in fact, match Stephen Vargas. But that made sense. He owned it. So the only one that really mattered was the one stamped in blood. The bloody fingerprint had a shape called a tented arch. Of the three features of fingerprints, loops, arches, and whorls, arches are the least common, and tented arches are rarer still. Only 5% of the population has them. Stephen Vargas was among that group. But the fingerprint on the flashlight wasn't clear enough to make a definitive comparison. Vargas might have left it, and then again, maybe not.
I cannot say he did not leave that print behind. I can only say it's not enough to identify it positively.
They thought the flashlight would illuminate the killer. Without it, their hopes of solving the case looked considerably more dim. Investigators working to solve the Becky Vargas homicide saw their most promising piece of evidence rendered useless. According to Detective Wheeloth, a case that had looked cut and dried now depended on very fragile clues.
After we lost the flashlight, about the last piece of physical evidence we had that we could try and do anything with were the leaf fragments that were recovered out of the Jeep.
If investigators could find specks of blood on the tiny fragments, they would support the idea that Stephen Vargas was close enough to the body to have tracked them into his Jeep. It fell to supervising criminalist Pilar Shortsleeve to analyze the minuscule samples.
Trying to see blood on a small piece of colorful leaf was difficult. So we used a stereo zoom so we could get down and look very closely at the leaves, and then to kind of guesstimate if we had any stains, and then we would do some preliminary tests. Well,
out of the 5 samples of leaves, Pilar Shortsleeve found traces of blood on 2. But she had no proof the blood was the victim's. She rushed the samples to a DNA lab for analysis, fearing it might already be too late.
Whenever blood or body fluids are left on soil or samples that contain a lot of possible bacteria, the bacteria begin immediately in destroying the sample. They destroy not only the cells, but they get into the DNA and start to break the DNA down.
It would take 3 months for the results to come back from the lab. Investigators had to bide their time, but they didn't do it idly. They had to assume that the results would be negative and began to build their case some other way. Police served a warrant to search Vargas's apartment. They were after the bathrobe and slippers he was seen wearing at the crime scene. If he had beaten his wife to death, surely they'd be blood spattered. Vargas left the clothes in plain sight, easy to find.
What are you looking for, Detective? Murder. He was supposed to be wearing a bathrobe and a pair of slippers.
The bathrobe had been freshly laundered. The slippers had no trace of debris on them. That in itself was strange, considering he admitted walking outdoors in them.
It seemed like Stephen Vargas was one step ahead of us on getting rid of any physical evidence that might link him to the crime scene. It seemed like every step that we thought of to locate that evidence was foiled.
Robert?
But there was one clue he couldn't bury, because it was 375 miles away in Cheyenne, Wyoming. After several weeks of wrestling with his conscience, Vargas's half-brother, Robert Esquivel, called police to tell of a favor that Stephen had asked before Becky's murder.
Steve had asked him if he would come out here and kill Becky for him.
Police set up a phone tap in Esquivel's apartment and had him call Vargas to get him to talk about their previous conversation.
Steve had gone through this denying or not remembering that part of their conversation, that it had been a joke, and towards the end even got threatening.
Though it stopped short of a confession, Vargas had said enough for police to arrest him on January 11, 1996, for the murder of Becky Vargas. But they weren't sure they had enough evidence to convict him. 1 month later, the results of the DNA test on the blood-spattered leaves found in Stephen Vargas's Jeep came through. A comparison of the DNA from the blood on the leaves matched Becky Vargas's DNA.
The blood on the blood fragments matched Rebecca Vargas.
Now,
Yes.
authorities were confident of a conviction.
Where are you going?
Based on the evidence, police put together a likely scenario. Stephen Vargas, angry with his wife for her infidelity and their upcoming divorce, confronted her at her new apartment. They fought.
Don't you dare accuse me of being a bad woman, don't you?
It escalated. And he hit her with the flashlight, knocking her out. He moved her to the side of the house, thinking she was dead. He was wrong. He wanted someone else to find the body, so he asked the McLeans to check up on her. They mistook her death throes for the throes of passion. When they told Stephen, he returned to finish what he'd begun, using a more lethal weapon. Tiny fragments of leaves told the whole story.
Well, in this case in particular, we had this flashlight that had a possible fingerprint in it, in blood, and that would have been the piece of evidence that kind of closed all the loose ends, but it didn't happen. In this case, it was a very small piece of leaf that was found in a vehicle that had blood on it that came from the victim, and it was just the interesting and exciting part that something so small could be so integral in a case.
Stephen Vargas was convicted of first-degree murder and is now serving 20 years to life. The case of Becky Vargas began with the discovery of her body. But when a person just disappears, it's not clear that a crime has even been committed. In this story, the names of the victim and the killer have been changed. On the morning of July 31st, 1987, Dan Remington of San Diego, California, was taking his kids to the YMCA. En route, he noticed his wife's abandoned car on the side of the road. Not wanting to alarm his children, he dropped them off at daycare, then rushed home to call the police. San Diego police dispatched an officer. On his way to Remington's house, he stopped to examine the vehicle. The car apparently had a flat tire. The doors were locked, and he could see no spare, nor any sign of 29-year-old Liz Remington. When the officer arrived at the Remingtons' home, Dan Remington told him that he last saw his wife at 10:30 the previous night when she left for work.
About 10:30 last night. We're going to go and get ready to go for work. All of it.
After he saw her car at 7:30, he called the hospital where she was a maternity nurse, but she hadn't shown up. Remington admitted that their 12-year marriage was rocky. They were discussing divorce, but hadn't filed the papers yet.
I called around and made a couple phone numbers. You have by chance have a key for the vehicle?
Dan handed the officer a key to the car and granted permission to impound it in search of clues. While it was possible that Liz's disappearance could be logically explained, missing persons cases fell under the domain of the homicide unit. They had the skills to collect and preserve every piece of potential evidence found at the scene.
Check the spare yet?
They found nothing obvious to indicate foul play and towed the car to the police garage. Any overlooked clues would be preserved in case the car required a closer look. Detectives visited a nearby convenience store, thinking that Liz might have gone there after her tire went flat. The clerk told them that she had been in the night before. She needed to break a $20 bill to make a phone call. He didn't know who she called. Police remembered that Dan Remington told them she hadn't called home. It seemed reasonable to believe she may have simply run off with someone else. Liz's sister told police that was inconceivable. She wasn't the kind of woman who'd run from a failing marriage. No matter how bad things became, she'd never leave her children. Sergeant Dennis Brugos of the San Diego Metro Task Force found that was the consensus.
She was very devoted to her children and her family. She helped at school, she helped at Little League, and just not the type of woman that would ever walk away from her family.
Liz's sister told police it was strange that the spare tire was missing. Dan had changed the oil 2 weeks earlier and made a point of thoroughly checking the car, including the spare. Investigators took statements from the Remingtons' neighbors. Many spoke of the deteriorating relationship between Liz and Dan. The information was duly noted, but in terms of evidence that any crime had been committed, investigators had absolutely nothing. At the time of Liz Remington's disappearance, San Diego police were grappling with an apparent serial killer. Because there was no evidence that Remington had left against her will, these more violent crimes took priority.
There was no body, there was no weapon, and therefore she was simply one of many missing adults throughout this county. And at that particular time, there was actually a series of sorts that was going on where there was upwards of 40 women who were found murdered in the East County area. So certainly that would have precedent over a missing person.
4 years passed since Liz Remington's disappearance. Most of the murdered women were transients or prostitutes, so she was not considered one of the killer's victims. But when a task force was formed to look into the serial killings, her file came up too, and investigators realized she was still missing after all this time. The neighbors' taped statements and the detective reports were dusted off. Well before Liz's disappearance, they had kept a close eye on the Remingtons and helped Liz out whenever they could. Over time, friction between the couple increased, and neighbors grew concerned about her and the children. One even kept a log of what went on at the house after Liz disappeared. To demonstrate how the Remingtons' relationship had deteriorated, a neighbor told investigators about how Dan tried to sell Liz's car without her permission. According to the neighbor, Liz wasn't just surprised, she was furious. A huge fight ensued. He said that the only reason Dan didn't sell the vehicle was because Liz had the only key and wouldn't give it to him. But police recalled that on the day Liz disappeared, Dan had the key to her vehicle in his possession. Police also learned that neighbors had reported seeing Dan Remington filling in a ravine at the back of his property with a bulldozer shortly after Liz's disappearance. They said that after her disappearance, they saw him visit that part of the property every few days. He never ventured back there before she disappeared. Remarkably, because the case had never been officially closed, Liz's car had remained impounded all this time. Dan had sued to get it released, but lost. Technically, it was still considered evidence. Now it would be looked at more thoroughly. One of the first things investigators found were coins in the ashtray. Purportedly, Liz had been last seen by a convenience store clerk when she wanted change to make a phone call. The clerk's statement suggested she was okay. Now, investigators weren't so certain, since she had ample change in her car. They contacted the clerk to interview him again.
That clerk at the convenience store actually said he wasn't real sure that it was her. So that helped us to establish the fact that we didn't really know for sure whether she was there.
Suspicions of foul play had been aroused. Rugos wondered if the flat tire could have been staged. He sent the flattened tire from Liz's car to Goodyear Tire and Rubber in Akron, Ohio. Their lab is designed to evaluate the causes of tire failure.
Here?
The tire was examined on the rim.
Report was the tire was flat, is still flat, there's definitely no...
Investigators found no outward signs of damage. Only a tiny puncture, which would have led to slow deflation. Once the leak was isolated, Product Analysis Manager Chester Patterson took the tire off its mount and examined it more thoroughly. From the looks of it, the tire went flat after the car had stopped.
We saw no damage on this tire. We saw no reason to have alerted any driver in the vehicle that something was going soft or whether the tire was deflating. Because in order to do that, the tire is beginning to come apart, and you would see that damage on the tire itself, and we saw no such damage.
But he did see something he'd never seen in his 35 years' experience. The tire removed from Liz Remington's car had been punctured from the inside out.
This tire has been punctured from the inside. See these two impressions, circular impressions, right under the punctures of the tire. And we notice the rust that's contained in them. and told me that somebody had taken a nail and pounded it through the inside of the tire to cause that circular nail head impressions on the liner itself.
He concluded that the tire had definitely been tampered with. 4 years after Liz Remington's disappearance, investigators had enough to get a warrant to search Dan Remington's house. They found nothing of significance inside. Outside told a different story. In the yard, a police backhoe went to work excavating the filled-in ravine.
The backhoe was probably 2 or 3 hours into the job when it hooked onto a piece of chain-link fence that was lying flat. The excavation slowed down. What we found underneath that chain-link fence was a tire.
The tire was the missing tire from Liz's car, and underneath that tire, wrapped in sheets and blankets, was the body of a female. And a missing persons investigation became a murder case.
Sir, put your hands on the counter.
Dan Remington was arrested and taken away. Officially, the body was considered a Jane Doe until a positive ID could be made. A forensic anthropologist determined the remains were those of a Caucasian female who had died of blunt trauma to the head. She had been in her late 20s to early 30s, about the same height as Liz Remington. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for, but the law required more proof than that. Forensic dentist Norman Sperber was called in.
Everything hinged on the teeth. Teeth are the most durable part of the body, and we fortunately had dental films from her dentist. We were able to take films of her teeth because they were in very good condition.
By comparing the shape and position of the victim's fillings and teeth with Liz Remington's dental records, Sperber was able to make a positive ID. Liz Remington had been found. Because the victim was discovered wrapped in bed linens, investigators believed that Dan killed her while she was napping before work. Afterward, he carried the body out to the ravine, buried it in a shallow grave, then rented the earth-moving equipment a short time later, piling on 8 to 12 feet of dirt. Then he drove to the scene and replaced the good tire with the one he had flattened. Next morning, he reported his wife missing, confident the police would never piece it together. His unwitting accomplice was a suspected serial killer who demanded all of the police department's resources. But the clues eventually resurfaced, exposing the crime. Though Remington's exact motive will never be known, authorities believe he couldn't bear the shame of divorce or the fact that he'd lose half of his wealth and property. In October 1992, Dan Remington was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life without parole. Remington went to a great deal of trouble to hide his crime. Others take an easier approach, which sometimes makes their crimes harder to solve. On September 21st, 1995, a body was discovered in a wooded area in Boise, Idaho. Plastic bags bound with duct tape encased the feet and head. From its state of decay, it had obviously been there several days. No ID was found. No attempt had been made to conceal the body. It appeared to have been hurriedly dumped there. Because of its position and wrappings, investigators couldn't even determine the victim's gender without disturbing an already disturbing scene. At this point, anything could be a clue, so the body wasn't unwrapped or inspected until it got to the morgue, where it was scrutinized under controlled conditions.
Okay.
The tape was carefully cut away, and the bags removed and preserved. The victim was female, around 60 years old. The coroner determined that she was strangled. She was most likely killed elsewhere, wrapped up, and transported to the woods where she was found. She fit the description of Wanda Kuzmichev, reported missing 6 days earlier. Wanda had been reported missing by her second husband, Ben Kuzmichev, when she failed to return from work. The couple had been married just 4 months. Both had retired from the large firm they worked for. Wanda took a job cleaning offices.
You are beautiful.
Thank you.
Ben, a Russian immigrant who had once been artistic director for the Idaho Ballet, now worked for a security company. After Ben reported her missing, detectives wondered if Wanda had had second thoughts about her second marriage and simply run off. But a check of her jewelry and possessions showed she'd taken nothing with her. That's never a good sign. And then her body turned up. The victim's car had not been found, so the bags she was wrapped in became the most important clue. Criminalist Cynthia Hill set to work examining them. It was all she had.
Well, in this case, we didn't have a murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses, and the place where Wanda was found was not the murder scene. So all these things were playing against us.
Hill fumed the bags in superglue to bring out any fingerprints. The glue, contained in foil pouches, vaporizes and bonds to the print, preserving it. The print can then be dusted with powder to make it more visible. Then photographed to create a record. Hill found only one print on the bag around the victim's legs, but so far she had no one to compare it with. Ben Kuzmichev was called to the police station to provide a set of prints for comparison. In a murder investigation, it's standard procedure to get a spouse's prints.
You ever been fingerprinted before?
No, sir.
Let me do all the work, okay?
Usually, it eliminates the spouse as a suspect. In this case, that isn't quite how it worked out.
Keep this?
The print on the bag matched Ben's. That didn't necessarily mean he'd had a hand in his wife's murder. If the bag had been taken from the victim's own car, Ben might have handled it prior to its use in the crime. The print was lifted from a portion of the bag where one would normally grab it. In terms of evidence, it wasn't enough.
These people are living together. They're touching objects that one another touch. You have to be able to find a fingerprint in a location where they wouldn't normally have touched, or it's in conjunction with another piece of evidence that puts them at the scene.
Hill still believed that the bags might contain more prints. Though she didn't have the technology to lift them, she knew that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Crime Lab did. If prints were there, the Mounties could find them, or so she hoped. She carefully packed her bags, sent them to Canada, and awaited the results. While Cynthia Hill waited for her prints to come from Canada, investigators in Idaho found Wanda Kuzmichev's car. More than a week had passed since her body was discovered. The vehicle had been abandoned in a store parking lot 4 miles from where she was found. Police processed the vehicle for fingerprints. They raised 2 prints from the trunk lid. Their placement suggested they were left by the person closing the trunk. Inside, investigators found something surprising. Nothing at all. For Detective David Smith of the Boise, Idaho Police Department, that was a significant discovery.
In talking with the family members, they said that she would always carry her Jehovah's Witness literature in the trunk. In fact, they said you could not put anything in her trunk because it was so full.
But the trunk wasn't entirely empty. Investigators found a single drop of blood. It belonged to the victim. Whoever had put her in the trunk had also left fingerprints on the gear shift knob. Prints on the trunk and on the gear shift matched Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators faced the same challenges as before. The car belonged to Ben's wife. It stood to reason that he could leave his fingerprints on it. Still, it seemed strange that his were the only clear prints found, especially since he told police that as far as he knew, Wanda was the last person to drive the vehicle. The evidence suggested that Ben drove it last, leaving behind the clearest prints.
Tests were conducted to show that in approximately 70% of all cases, the last person who drives the car and activates the gear shift lever will destroy the person's prints who drove the car prior to and leave their prints on the gear shift lever.
The prints made detectives 70% sure that Ben Kuzmichev was lying. That wasn't good enough. An inspection of the car seat disclosed another clue.
I knew Wanda's stature in that she was 5'4" and 140 pounds. When I looked at the seat, it appeared to me to be back farther than usual for a woman of that stature to be driving the vehicle. So I placed a female of 5'4", 140 pounds inside the vehicle. She was unable to reach the pedals, which appeared to be a comfortable driving position. Conversely, I put a male matching Ben's description, 5'11", 190 pounds, into the driver's seat, and they fit very comfortable.
The experiment provided more circumstantial proof that Ben was a liar, but it still didn't prove he was a murderer. By now, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police Lab had performed their tests on the trash bag used to wrap the body of Wanda Kuzmichev. The test, called vacuum metal deposition, is a state-of-the-art method for lifting difficult prints from plastic. The bag was placed in a vacuum chamber and then pelted with ions of gold, which cling to the plastic but not to the oily prints. Then it's exposed to ionized zinc, which clings only to the gold, leaving the prints untouched and in contrast against the plastic. The process revealed a second print on the bag. According to Cynthia Hill, the position of this print was far more incriminating.
The second fingerprint that was developed using the vacuum metal deposition proved that he had a direct contact with that bag because the positioning of the hand was in such a way that he would be grabbing the plastic bag, wrapping the tape around Wanda, and he would be the only one that would be leaving the fingerprint in that position at that time.
In most cases, that would be enough to win a conviction. But investigators weren't so sure. Proving a spousal murder on fingerprints alone would be a hard sell. The prints and other evidence they'd gathered gave them enough to get a search warrant for the Kuzmichevs' home. they found no signs that this was the murder scene. But they did find the Jehovah's Witness literature that the victim's family said she never removed from her car. The items presented more circumstantial evidence that Ben had been involved in the murder. By January 1996, 4 months after the crime, investigators were still building their case against Ben Kuzmichev.
Detective!
He began to feel the circle of evidence closing in on him, and he announced he was going back to Russia. At that point, police had no choice but to charge him with Wanda's murder.
But let me go.
If he returned to Russia, he'd be a free man, beyond U.S. extradition. Though they had enough to arrest him, they weren't certain they had a solid case for murder in the first. Between the time of his arrest and the trial date, investigators continued to gather evidence against Kuzmichev. Under surveillance in jail, he couldn't make a move without authorities knowing about it.
We placed monitoring devices on approximately 17 phones inside the jail at the Ada County Jail. That gave us the ability to monitor his conversations as outgoing as well as whoever he was seeing as a visitor. The end result was that we received nothing that could be used in court. Nothing incriminating came about the phone calls.
But help came from an unlikely source. Kuzmichev had confided details of his crime to his cellmate. The prisoner, disturbed by Kuzmichev's lack of remorse, reported the details to authorities. He had nothing to gain by doing so.
Ben and his cellmate were watching TV one evening when the news media broadcast that we had located a witness who had told us that she had, in fact, sold Ben duct tape and trash bags. The inmate told us that Ben found this humorous, that he had, in fact, purchased from this lady, but they were not the ones that we were looking for that he used in the crime.
The inmate's information, though hearsay, provided one more strike against Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators realized they'd gathered all they were going to get. They weren't sure they had enough. But because Ben was likely to be released and flee to Russia, they had to take the case to trial. From what police could put together, 4 months after their marriage, Ben and Wanda's honeymoon was over. He had been dependent on her money, but wanted to return to his homeland. She refused to go. Their animosity built, and Ben strangled her. He wrapped her body in plastic bags, emptied the trunk of her car, loaded her in, and dumped her in the woods. Then he abandoned the car in the parking lot. Based on the accumulated evidence, Ben Kuzmichev was convicted for the second-degree murder of his wife, Wanda, and sentenced to 21 years to life. For Detective David Smith, solving this case meant more than simply delivering justice.
You do become personally involved. I mean, this guy has come to your town, committed this heinous act, and now you have this grieving family that you want to do everything in your power to solve this case for. And that's how I personally take it, and I know any other seasoned homicide detective will tell you the same thing.
When spouse kills spouse, the clues are sometimes difficult to read. But the marriage of forensic science with good detective work can bring together what the killer had tried to put asunder. A blazing house fire illuminates cold-blooded homicide and has possibly destroyed all evidence leading to the killer. It looked like a suicide. Now investigators aren't so sure. The clues are unusual, but do they add up to murder? A killer tries to steer investigators down the wrong road. Can forensics get them back on course? To solve a case, authorities have to know who to trust that can be a challenge when key players bear false witness. At 6:37 a.m. on August 2nd, 1992, the Evansville, Indiana fire station sprang into action at the report of a burning house. A woman was trapped inside. Intense heat foiled their rescue attempts. The billowing smoke became impenetrable. It was thickest in the bedroom, where the victim was purported to be. The fierce blaze was quickly extinguished, but too late. They couldn't save her. Any loss of life is tragic, but this one struck a personal note with some of the officers on the scene. The call had been made by Evansville police officer Patrick Bradford, who had stopped by the house after his shift and noticed the smoke. The house belonged to 24-year-old Tammy Lohr. Now she was dead. Lohr worked as a civilian jailer for the county. She dreamed of a life in law enforcement and hoped to one day become a police officer.
All right, what we got was where the body was on the bed.
Once the fire was extinguished and the victim removed, investigators walked through the house to see what might have caused it.
They're examining that. They got.
To Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, the evidence led to one conclusion.
We were able to determine that the fire was suspicious in nature very early on, after we made an initial walkthrough of the building and had determined there were some burn patterns in the carpet that were suspicious and very much similar to those produced when a liquid accelerant is poured on the floor.
And what they did as he came out.
The fire burned a trail on the carpet leading from the bed to the bedroom door. A gasoline can still stood at the epicenter of the blaze. Carpet samples were collected to confirm the presence of the accelerant. Investigators found other signs of foul play. An electrical engineer determined that circuit breakers to the bedroom had been switched off at the box, not tripped by an electrical problem caused by the fire. The phone lines had been cut and shorted together. Anyone calling would have heard a busy signal. And the scuttle hole cover, the hatch leading to the attic, was lying on the floor just outside the bedroom. Soot deposits revealed it had been removed prior to the blaze. Evansville Police Department crime scene investigator Michael Ford witnessed the result.
It was obvious the fire that came out of the room vented through the scuttle cover just right outside the bedroom door, which would have helped vent the fire and let the fire burn a little bit more. It would have taken the fire into the attic and created a more extensive burn on the house.
A smoke detector collected from the scene was missing its battery.
Did y'all guys check the window?
Yeah, well, you guys didn't cut this out.
As the investigators finished with the bedroom area, they looked at the rest of the house. In the kitchen, they found the window propped open with one of the victim's rings. And the screen had been cut. They presumed this was the murderer's entry point. But they weren't entirely certain. For one thing, it was small and not easily accessible.
This is the exact size and everything of the kitchen window. And one of the unique things about it was right below this window at a level about right here, there was a kitchen sink. And on the back of the kitchen sink were several items that had someone come in through this window would have been knocked over. There were some pots and pans that would have made a substantial amount of noise by someone coming through the window.
Investigators also noted that if this were a break-in, the motive wasn't clear. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Attention focused on the window, the alleged point of entry. Something wasn't right about it. In fact, working with a model of the window, investigators determined that whoever cut the screen wasn't breaking in, but breaking out. Based on the angle of the slash through the screen, Ford believed that it most likely had been cut from the inside.
And indicating that a right-handed person would have had to almost cut this screen from the inside, leaning over the counter, because the screen goes from a lower area on the right-hand side to a higher area on the left-hand side, indicating that a right-handed person would have been more than likely to make that pattern from the inside as opposed to the outside.
While investigators pondered the clues, Officer Bradford drove himself to the police station to answer questions about what he saw before he reported the fire. Because Bradford had entered the burning house and was the last person near the body, as part of standard procedure, he handed over his uniform so it could be tested. Investigators hoped it would yield evidence that might have otherwise been destroyed by the flames in the house. Patrick Bradford told investigators that the victim was his mistress. He'd last seen her around 10 the previous night on his way to work. When he finished his shift around 6:30 a.m., he stopped by. As he pulled down the street, he saw smoke billowing out of her house. He said he rushed into the burning building, dropped to his knees, and crawled to the bedroom door, where he saw the bed engulfed in flames. He couldn't find Tammy. That's when he radioed for help. Because the break-in looked staged, investigators suspected that Lore might have known her killer and opened the door to him or her. Bradford suggested that Evansville Police Detective Guy Minnis talk to one of Lore's former co-workers.
Patrick told us that Tammy had some problems with another jailer that used to work in the jail with her, and the day that the body was discovered, that was one of the first people that we interviewed.
Come in and ask a few questions.
Lore had once reported her colleague for making sexual comments and using excessive force on the prisoners. It cost him his job and earned Tammy Lore a sworn enemy. He claimed he was home all night and didn't get out of bed until after 7 that morning. His wife vouched for him.
And when I interviewed him, I felt that he was being honest, and I was also looking for his wife's reactions because she was kind of standing in the background as I was talking to him, and when he told us where he was and who he was with, I didn't get any kind of reactions from her. We're running south on Bakey.
By now, the major physical clues to the case had been gathered.
Another one of the pictures of the job.
Still, police had no real suspects and no clear-cut
well
motive.
That's a black eye rock.
But their next clue would come from the victim herself. Evansville fire investigators were certain that the fire that destroyed Tammy Lore's house was intentionally set. But the fire had also apparently destroyed all clues leading to who set it and why. Then the autopsy provided some surprising information. Tammy Lore hadn't died in the fire. She had been stabbed 21 times and had no smoke in her lungs. She had been murdered before the arson. The fire was apparently an effort to hide blatant homicide. The murder was revealed, but investigator Ford thought the murderer might have succeeded in obliterating his identity.
As far as fiber type evidence and things like that, because of the fire we knew that a lot of that evidence was going to be destroyed. Unfortunately, we would not be able to do the vacuumings of the floor, the search of the bedclothes for hair and fiber of a perpetrator. That was going to be destroyed.
We can take and open this up and test it.
Police hoped that Officer Bradford's uniform might hold some clues the fire destroyed. At the lab, Jesse Story analyzed the uniform for traces of accelerant. Petroleum-based hydrocarbon accelerants are, by their nature, highly volatile. The hydrocarbon detector is sensitively calibrated to electronically sniff for the chemicals as they evaporate. It can detect flammable molecules on the order of 1 part per million. Investigators found no trace of the accelerant on Bradford's uniform. That made sense. He said he crawled into the house and stopped at the bedroom door. The accelerant had been confined to the bedroom, so Bradford wouldn't have picked any up on his clothes. Tests on the bedroom carpet confirmed that it was saturated with it. In the lab, fibers clinging to Bradford's uniform were compared to fibers taken from the victim's home. Bradford's uniform had not a single fiber on it from the house. That was peculiar, considering he said he'd crawled through the home to save Tammy. If Bradford really did crawl across the carpet, he would have had to pick up fibers. Bradford's story started to fray. Investigators felt that he and his wife, Dawn, might know more than they were admitting. Authorities knew that Bradford had been seeing Lore behind his wife's back for 4 years. The affair showed no sign of ending anytime soon. Dawn, who suspected her husband's infidelity, might have seen fit to kill his mistress.
That was a theory that was popular amongst many citizens here in Evansville. They thought that Dawn killed Tammy and that Patrick set the fire to cover up the murder that his wife had committed.
Polygraphs were ordered for Patrick and Dawn Bradford. The test measures the changes in heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure that often occur when a person isn't telling the truth. Dawn passed the lie detector test, showing no prior knowledge of the crime, and was cleared as a suspect. Patrick's results were deemed inconclusive. Another test was scheduled for the following week. Police continued to gather interviews to get a clearer picture of what happened at Tammy Lore's house.
Maybe you'd like to talk with me.
Sure do. Hi, Mr. Trey. I'm just have a seat over here at my desk. Over here.
Her neighbor said that Bradford, apparently distracted, almost ran into him pulling into the driveway that morning. They greeted each other. Bradford didn't seem frantic, and the neighbor said he didn't see any smoke. Other witnesses said they drove by the house that morning, saw Bradford's car in the driveway, and also didn't see smoke. By the time the fire engines arrived, 3 minutes, 40 seconds after Bradford made the call, the fire had ravaged the bedroom. Based on the type of fire it was, a mattress doused in gasoline, investigators knew that it burned fast and created blinding amounts of smoke. It couldn't have been on fire long prior to Officer Bradford's arrival. But the larger question was, did it actually start after he arrived? Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, for one, thought Bradford's statement about his rescue attempt was just a smokescreen.
His description was that he saw flames 6 to 12 inches high and the tips breaking off whenever he got to the bedroom door was not very feasible to us because we knew what the heat and smoke conditions were whenever accelerant is used in a compartmentalized area such as this bedroom. And it was our contention that had he got that far inside the house, that he definitely would have been overcome by smoke if not killed.
Determining if Bradford had actually set the fire required a down-to-the-second reconstruction of the events that morning. In order to prove Bradford had time to burn the house, Minnis began to create a detailed timeline of the suspect's activity. He realized Bradford would have had to drive past an ATM on his way to Tammy Lohr's house. Its camera faced the street. Detective Minnis requested a copy of the ATM tape for the morning of the fire. Sure enough, it showed Bradford's car driving in the direction of Lohr's house at 6:34 a.m. "65 seconds later, he called the fire department. Minnis, stopwatch in hand, retraced Bradford's route. It took him only 18 seconds to go from the ATM to the victim's house.
When I drove the route, I found that Bradford could commit the crime of arson in the 65 seconds that he had, from the time that he drove by the ATM until the time that he called in the fire on his walkie-talkie. He had plenty of time to pour out the gasoline, set it on fire, and then call the fire in.
But arson was only part of the story. He couldn't have had enough time to kill Tammy Lohr, tamper with the electricity and phone, stage a break-in, and then set the fire. That part of the story had yet to be told. Investigators hoped that Patrick Bradford would tell it. He kept his appointment for his second polygraph test and was asked questions specific to the staging of the scene. He denied involvement. He failed.
The sergeant and I both interviewed Patrick Bradford at that time once we knew that he had failed the polygraph test. And that's when I knew for certain that we had the right guy. Go up into the attic.
Now, investigators had to prove it. The current timeline didn't allow enough time for Bradford to murder Tammy. They reasoned that just because the fire was started in the morning didn't mean that that was when the murder took place. The condition of the body made time of death impossible to determine. But Tammy had spoken to her father on the phone at 10:30 the night before the fire.
You can kind of see right there.
So she was murdered between then and 6:30 the next morning.
Underneath the kitchen windows where the burglary was set up. Investigators looked into Officer Bradford's timesheets the night before the fire. They found one gap in his report. Shortly before 11 p.m., he radioed in that he needed to run some errands. Then there was a break of about an hour when he could not be accounted for. Patrick, of course, told us that he never went by the house at any point in time during that evening, other than when he was going to work in his personal car and he stopped by to see Tammy for a few minutes. Then he continued on to work and got his police car.
Working with this new time frame, detectives went back to their files. They re-interviewed neighbors about what they might have seen. One woman was driving above the speed limit through the neighborhood and saw a police cruiser parked at the victim's house. She checked her speed and slowed down. It was around 11 p.m. Evansville investigators had now placed Bradford at the house the night before and proved he had enough time to commit murder. They felt they'd gathered enough evidence against one of their own. Officer Patrick Bradford was arrested for the murder of Tammy Lohr. As for motive, lately Bradford and Lohr were having difficulties. Police surmised that on the night of August 1st, the two had an argument that was settled by murder. The passerby had placed Bradford at the scene, and his logbook showed he had the opportunity. He returned to the house the following morning, as was his habit. Only this was to be the last time. He finished what he'd started, pouring the gasoline and striking the match. Patrick Bradford was convicted of murder and arson. He was sentenced to 80 years. Murders, like clandestine love affairs, require an elaborate deception. But that level of deceit can seldom bear close scrutiny. It's easy to see how a place like Farmville gets its name. The little community of about 6,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills of central Virginia, retains its rural charm in a fast-paced world. But even a quiet town like this is not immune to tragedy. On December 11, 1991, just after 1 p.m., Farmville police received a call about a shooting at the home of Robert Bruce. Detective Jack Bryant was dispatched to the scene. Though shootings are uncommon here, this one wasn't totally unexpected.
I was driving on South Main Street. I received a radio call from a dispatcher to go to 600 High Street. There had been a shooting. And my immediate reaction was that Mr. Bruce had shot himself because he was scheduled for sentencing on an embezzlement charge.
Farmville police began the case with an assumption. An assumption that proved wrong the instant Robert Bruce answered the door. They were surprised to find that Robert Bruce wasn't the victim. They were even more surprised to learn that it was his wife, Carol, who had apparently committed suicide. Robert Bruce told detectives that he and Carol had an argument that morning.
Half hour, 45 minutes ago maybe.
He took their children to school, returned to the house for a brief period, and then left to go to an appointment at the bank.
I don't know.
When he returned home, he found her dead. Carol Bruce lay on the sofa in the den, a bullet to her head. Any crime scene, even a suicide, must be thoroughly documented. Before anything was touched or moved, every inch was photographed and measured. The room was much warmer than the rest of the house, and the victim was covered with an Afghan. A .32 caliber Colt revolver lay on the carpet. The victim's hand was thrust awkwardly into a gardening glove. Though it appeared to be a suicide, these details raised doubts in Detective Bryant's mind.
And the glove was just partially on the hand. It wasn't on a hand as someone would normally put a glove on.
Investigators compiled a growing list of troubling details. They noted that the gun was more than 2 feet from the victim's trigger hand, and that the overheated room would change the body temperature and thwart attempts to gauge an accurate time of death. It all seemed too suspicious. Detectives began to doubt that Carol Bruce took her own life. They feared she might have had help. In Farmville, Virginia, as Detective Bryant investigated the mysterious death of Carol Bruce, he began to suspect that she had been murdered. To prove it, he started with the gun. A trace of the serial number revealed that it was local. He went to talk with the owner. It had been reported stolen to Detective Bryant 5 months earlier, taken out of a car in the Bruce's neighborhood. The owner made no secret of the fact that he kept the gun in his vehicle, but he had no idea how it ended up in Carol Bruce's hand. At the morgue, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim was killed by a single bullet to the brain. It entered the right temple and lodged in the lower left portion of her head. But the autopsy couldn't explain who fired it.
The initial results of the autopsy was that it was a routine suicide. And the department did not actually make a ruling on it. The chief left that to me to do. And anytime that I was contacted about it, I just said it has not been ruled a suicide or a homicide. It's still under investigation.
The gun and the slug retrieved from the victim's skull were sent to the Virginia State Crime Lab. There, the gun was test-fired. The water chamber stops the bullet without adding extraneous marks. Usually, that allows investigators to compare the test-fired bullet with ones at a crime scene. But in this case, the lands and grooves of the crime scene bullet were too faint to be read. As a formality, investigators examined the cartridge casing taken from the scene with one test fired in the lab. By comparing the markings on the two casings, technicians determined that the fatal shot was fired from the weapon found near the victim. Less certain was who fired it. Detective Bryant had some doubts. Bryant wasn't alone in his suspicions.
I appreciate you coming in.
Carol's friends had told him that even though Carol and Robert were having marital problems, she was excited about planning her future. Carol taught physical education at the local college and was preparing to earn her doctorate. Then, 3 days before she was scheduled to take her graduate school exam, she was found dead. Carol's friends also told Bryant that the idea she shot herself seemed unlikely.
She was petrified of any type of guns. She just didn't allow them in the house. So that was another thing I couldn't believe. Number one, I couldn't believe that she would have stolen it to begin with. And number two, I could certainly that she would not have killed herself with it.
There had been no sign of an intruder in the house, so if it wasn't suicide, the most logical suspect was Robert Bruce, the beneficiary of his wife's $100,000 life insurance policy.
You have a lovely day.
Bruce had been an attorney, but he'd just been convicted of embezzling $30,000 from his clients and forced to pay restitution. He needed the money. Carol had contacted a divorce attorney to end their 16-year marriage. Her lawyer requested that Robert send him his financial records. But he hadn't filed his taxes for 5 years. After Carol's death, Robert Bruce was sentenced to several months in jail for embezzling. While he was incarcerated, the death investigation continued. Bryant had established a possible motive, but what of the opportunity? He was determined to get some resolution to this mystery.
This case just stayed on my mind all the time. I could wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and this case was on my mind just as strong as it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It just stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my mind and I knew it had to come to an end somewhere.
Bryant consulted his notes from Bruce's interview to reconstruct his movements on the morning of his wife's death. The school had a record of him dropping off his kids first thing. Then, Bruce said he puttered around the rental apartments he owned, but nobody saw him there. Then he had a meeting at the bank with an attorney. Investigators spoke with the attorney, who said that he had met with Robert Bruce that morning between 11 o'clock and 12 noon. Bruce left immediately after the meeting. His movements afterward were vouched for by his cousin's wife. She worked in an apparel shop, and Bruce stopped by to chat a while, as he frequently did. He left around 1 o'clock and returned home, where his wife lay dead.
As far as his whereabouts for the day, We had roughly from 9 to 11 that he could not actually prove where he was at. All of the other times he had witnesses.
That gap could have given Bruce the opportunity to kill his wife. Now, Bryant hoped forensics could prove she had died in that time frame. For help, he contacted Virginia State Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro. But estimating the time of death would be tricky.
Time of death is always an estimate. It's an estimate made based on when the person was last reliably seen alive, and the operative word there is reliably, and when the person was found.
Although Carol Bruce's body temperature suggested she died shortly before the police arrived, rigor mortis had already begun to set in. That typically takes several hours.
It appeared that she was dead for more hours than was reported.
In fact, Fierro's time of death estimate correlated with Robert Bruce's window of opportunity. Investigators faced one last challenge. Bruce's motive and opportunity were now firmly established. In order to prove that he pulled the trigger, they had to first prove that the victim couldn't possibly have pulled it herself. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Forensic Science Supervisor Ann Davis ran a trigger pull test to see if Carol Bruce, while partially wearing a gardening glove, fired the gun that ended her life. Davis added progressively more weight to the trigger to determine how much pressure the shooter would need to squeeze off a round. Tests determined that it would take at least 9 1/4 pounds of finger pressure to pull the trigger. Hampered by the glove, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to manage it. After the trigger pull test, Firearm and Toolmark Section Chief Jim Pickleman approached the case from another angle. He reconstructed the crime scene based on photos, and he constructed a mannequin and a dummy head to replicate the fatal bullet's trajectory. He found that the angle of the shot would have been too awkward for the victim to manage on her own. And the powder burns indicated that the gun was pushed directly against her head, which wasn't typical. The tests proved that the distance of the gun and the trajectory of the bullet were inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. Investigators finally had the proof they needed. Carol Bruce did not pull that trigger. In May 1993, Robert Bruce, having served his time for embezzling, was arrested again for murder. Police surmised that on the morning of her death, Carol had fallen asleep on the sofa. Robert came in with the gun stolen several months earlier. He turned up the thermostat to distort time of death estimates. He donned a glove to keep his own hands clean. Then he killed his wife with a single bullet, staged the scene to look like a suicide, covered her with a blanket, and slipped the glove awkwardly onto her hand.
The Bruce case represents a special kind of situation in forensic pathology. We call these masquerades. These are deaths where what you are seeing is not really what happened, and someone is trying to arrange a death to look like a death, a type of death which it is not.
Ultimately, Robert Bruce was unmasked by forensics. For his crime, he was sentenced to life. In masquerade deaths, investigators follow the evidence down two trails. One leads to the cause of death. The other, more twisted trail, leads to the killer. Around 10 p.m. on June 12, 1994, police were called to the scene of a car accident on a secluded road in Little Mountain, South Carolina. A woman had apparently driven off the road and crashed. She was dead at the scene. Yet, strangely, her vehicle was barely scratched. Officers of SLED, the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division, processed the vehicle. They found drops of blood in the back seat, damage to the car's interior, and the gear was in neutral. A footprint on the rear passenger side window suggested a violent struggle. Newberry, South Carolina Sheriff Lee Foster knew this was more than a tragic accident.
We noticed that there was absolutely no damage done to the vehicle, and certainly nothing that would have caused the blood or the injuries to the body. So all of those items in connection, I mean, it wasn't a traffic accident. It looked like something else had happened.
Only after the obvious clues were documented did the investigators search for the driver's identification. She was Victoria Beckham. Authorities had done all they could at the scene.
I don't know.
While her family was notified, the victim was removed and the car towed to the SLED laboratory for closer scrutiny. Police notified Stephen Beckham about his wife's death and their suspicions of foul play. He immediately came to the station to answer questions. He said he'd seen Vicky around 6:15 that evening when she dropped the kids off at his house. Vicky was separated from her husband and had moved back in with her parents. She and Stephen shared custody of their 3 children. Since the separation, she'd gotten a job and was preparing to sue Stephen for full custody. The autopsy confirmed suspicions of foul play. Vicky Beckham was shown to have blunt force trauma to her head and neck. The medical examiner determined that she'd been killed by asphyxiation due to a crushed windpipe. Whatever crushed it left unusual and unrecognizable markings. This was not the kind of injury one would sustain in a car accident. Because her body was already beginning to cool and stiffen when it was discovered at 10 p.m., her time of death was estimated to have been around 6:30, shortly after leaving her husband's house.
Stephen Beckham was the last person to have seen her alive. The investigators narrowed it down to the fact that she delivered the children, he saw her, and we needed to follow up further on that.
Because Beckham's house was the last place the victim had been seen alive, officers obtained a warrant to search it. They found nothing but a tennis shoe with what appeared to be a single drop of blood. That wasn't necessarily unusual, unless the blood happened to be from the murder victim. The tennis shoe was sent to the State Law Enforcement Division Forensic Laboratory, where forensic serologist Nancy Scraba tested it. First, she removed the stain with a cotton swab dampened with saline solution. Then she tested the swab by adding phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide. The chemical combination reacts with the hemoglobin in blood and turns pink. To prove it was blood, and more specifically human blood, Scraba used a process called crossover electrophoresis, which isolated the proteins and revealed them to be human. Unfortunately, the sample wasn't large enough to reveal the blood type. The same couldn't be said for the victim's car. Copious blood samples were collected from the front and back seat areas and also from the exterior rear door. All were tested and all were type A, the same as the victim's. Forensics had another tool in its arsenal. After the blood, fibers, and other samples were collected, the vehicle was processed for latent fingerprints. Fingerprinting is always the last step because the processes used to reveal latent prints can destroy other evidence. More than 30 prints or partial prints were eventually raised on the car. Many belonged to the Beckhams, some belonged to rescue workers, and most were difficult to read. SLED senior agent David Warren Black knew he had his work cut out for him.
They're not the pristine, picture-perfect thing that you would see. They were torqued, they were smeared, they were smudged. They're partial fragmentary impressions. Some may have even been the size, say, of a pencil eraser.
And each had to be compared against a database of hundreds and hundreds of known prints. It would take some time. But investigators were encouraged by the discovery of a partial smeared print stamped in blood on the car's exterior.
The fact that the print was in blood placed that print being put there after bloodletting occurred. So it could have only gotten placed there after Mrs. Beckham was assaulted.
While the print was being analyzed, police returned to the murder scene and stopped motorists to see if anyone driving by on the night of the murder might have witnessed anything. Several reported seeing a gold-colored car parked near the scene earlier that day. Sheriff Lee Foster felt the vehicle could be crucial.
The car was an important factor because it could have been involved in the murder, or it could have been somebody that witnessed it.
None who'd seen it could recall its make, model, or license number. Then, one man pulled over. He'd gotten a good look at it.
He said it was definitely a Pontiac. It was a Pontiac Grand Prix, and it was gold color, and he even went as far as talk about the type of wheels that it had on the car.
I said I had one just like it was the only year they made that.
And he said he knew it was a Pontiac Grand Prix because he had had a car earlier in his life similar to that, just not the same color. And he went on to tell us that the gold color was a very distinctive gold, that he didn't know that General Motors made a car that color anymore.
A check of motor vehicle records revealed hundreds of Grand Prix, but the database couldn't break them down by color. Far too many to check. A year passed with few leads and no real suspects. The paper and TV news did follow-up pieces on Vicki Beckham's murder. They focused on the gold car, apparently the only clue, and asked the public for information about it.
How are we doing today, Earl? I'm doing all right.
The reports jump-started the memory of an acquaintance of Stephen Beckham's. He told detectives that Stephen was a regular at a Myrtle Beach strip club, and a gold Grand Prix was parked in front of the club most of the time. Investigators checked the DMV dead file and found an expired registration for a 1980 Grand Prix that was owned by the proprietor of the strip club. Investigators also checked Beckham's phone records and found that he had made hundreds of calls to payphones in Myrtle Beach and to the strip club in the weeks prior to the murder. It was time to pay a visit to the owner of the club and bring along a search warrant. The proprietor admitted the car was his, but told investigators that a year earlier he'd loaned it to one of his bouncers, a man named Richard Anderson. The police had the car towed to the lab, where they could get a better look at it. The crime happened over a year earlier, and investigators weren't certain this was the car they were looking for. Nevertheless, they combed it for clues. In the trunk, they raised fingerprints that didn't match the owner's.
I've never seen her before in my life.
Police found the bouncer, Richard Anderson. He agreed to take a polygraph regarding his involvement with the Beckham murder. He denied knowing Beckham or anything about the murder. He failed. Investigators broke the news to him.
Anderson decided that he didn't want to cooperate anymore, but would give us hair, blood, and other forensic samples to conduct DNA testing because we were looking into the forensic aspect of the case as well.
But on the way to the hospital, Anderson requested that he be taken to the Attorney General's office. He had a confession to make. Richard Anderson, the key suspect in the murder of Vicki Beckham, decided to come clean. His confession revealed he was part of a deadly plan.
Anderson told us that he was contracted to kill Vicki Beckham because of the situation that was going on between Stephen and Vicki. His stories changed from time to time, but it never changed the fact that he was contracted by Stephen Beckham to get rid of the body.
Anderson said that the weekend before the murder, he and Beckham met face-to-face to finalize their plans. Prior to that, they had planned much of the murder through a series of telephone calls at prearranged locations. These locations matched Beckham's phone records. Beckham's plan was to murder Vicki after she came to his house to drop off the kids. She was supposed to be dead when Beckham delivered her to Anderson. But she was merely unconscious after Beckham had pistol-whipped her. Anderson was able to describe the gun that Beckham used for the beating. Anderson admitted that after Beckham left, he killed the victim with a bolt cutter, then staged the car accident. At the lab, technicians looked for evidence to prove that Anderson's story was true. Bolt cutters found in his house were analyzed for trace evidence. None was found, but the pathologist determined that the fatal injury was consistent with being struck by the tool. Anderson's fingerprints were compared to those found on the gold Grand Prix and the car where Vicki was found murdered. They matched. Investigators had enough to arrest Stephen Beckham and search his house. When they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. However, they did find a handgun like the one Anderson described. Forensics determined that the marks on the victim's head were consistent with characteristics of the handgun. Investigators had placed Anderson at the scene. They used the phone records to link Beckham to the crime. Stephen Beckham was arrested 4 days later in Chapin, South Carolina. According to Anderson's statements and what investigators could piece together, Vicki dropped the kids off at Stephen's house. Stephen somehow persuaded her to take a short drive with him. When they got to a secluded, prearranged place, Stephen stopped the vehicle. He beat Vicki into unconsciousness, then delivered her to Anderson. But she wasn't dead. When Anderson saw she was alive, he finished the job. Then he staged the accident. Detective Foster believed that Stephen bitterly resented Vicki's newfound independence and success. He had lost control of her and was in danger of losing his children. To keep his kids, he needed his wife out of the way.
He had previously convinced Vicki that she was never going to get custody of the children, but now she realized that that wasn't true. So there was going to be a hard custody battle going on.
For the murder of Vicki Beckham, Richard Anderson and Stephen Beckham were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Murderers often believe that they can hide their crimes behind a simple lie. In reality, they're only lying to themselves. The truth is in the evidence, and the evidence is always stacked against the false witness. An elderly woman is pulled from the murky waters of a rural pond in Alabama. A few scraps of evidence are all investigators have to link her to her killer.
We found her.
In Texas, the body of a woman swept away in a flash flood is found downstream. Can forensic scientists wash away deception and find proof of murder? A car crash on a country road in Wisconsin claims a woman's life. Detectives must wade through ambiguous evidence to prove her death was no accident. Once, water could dissolve evidence linking murderers to their crimes. But today, scientists can look beneath the surface for proof of homicide, even when the victims are found dead in the water. Grand Bay, Alabama, May 21st, 1994. Two teenagers boating on a pond, known locally as Blue Hole, noticed something floating in the water. As they approached, they realized it was a human body. They fled the scene and alerted their parents, who called the police. When the Mobile County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they recovered the body of an elderly woman. It was clear that this was not an accidental drowning. The victim had a tire jack chained around her waist, and her hands had been removed. As investigators began documenting the scene, detectives contacted the Sheriff's Department for a missing persons check. They hoped a search of NCIC, a database containing descriptions of people reported missing, could help them identify the victim. Sergeant Harold Bolster explains.
All missing person reports or missing persons are placed on the NCIC. And we look for any local matches, anything close to Mobile or Moss Point, Pascagoula, anything in the general region that might match up to what we had.
Only one name fit the description of the victim. 85-year-old Irma Williams had been reported missing the day before in nearby Moss Point, Mississippi. Dispatchers contacted Detective John J. Gaffney, who was investigating that disappearance.
And they advised that the Mobile County Sheriff's Office had discovered a body in Grand Bay, Alabama, which is the next jurisdiction over from us, and that they believed the body was could possibly be my missing person.
Detectives from the Moss Point, Mississippi Police Department were dispatched to the scene. After getting a detailed description of the victim from deputies, the detectives believed they had found Irma Williams. It appeared that their missing persons case was now a homicide. Investigators began searching the surrounding area for any evidence that would help them identify the killer. But a large amount of trash and debris had collected at the pond.
Take a look at this.
Determining what was evidence and what wasn't would be difficult. As investigators scoured the area near the water's edge, they found fresh tire tracks imprinted in the sand.
Zigzag pattern.
Unsure if these tracks had been left by the killer, plaster casts were made. As the search of the area continued, detectives noticed a cigarette butt with a flattened end hidden among some overgrowth. Unlike most of the trash in the area, it didn't appear to have been there very long. It was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Though investigators believed that the victim was Irma Williams, they needed a positive identification.
Make sure.
They contacted her relatives. James and Sharon Williams confirmed that the victim was James's grandmother, Irma Williams.
Okay, I know this is hard, but I'm gonna have to ask you a couple questions.
James told the officer he and his wife were very close to Irma.
As hard as I know, Sharon.
He described her as a vivacious woman who loved life and her family. Though her husband of more than 50 years had recently passed away, his estate had allowed her to remain independent. But James said that his father, Henderson Williams, was not close with Irma. In fact, Sharon added that Henderson hadn't seemed very worried when she told him no one could locate his mother. Sharon said she'd gone to Henderson's house around 11 p.m. the night before and found him burning trash in the yard. When told his mother was missing, Henderson seemed distracted and unconcerned. He was preoccupied by the fire the entire time.
You say she goes for a walk?
Despite Henderson's lack of concern, Sharon and James could not imagine that he was involved in his own mother's murder. The autopsy on Irma Williams was performed by Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs, the chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama. The official cause of death was listed as severe blunt force trauma to the head. Irma Williams had died well before being placed in the pond. And for Dr. Downs, the manner in which the victim's hands were removed was also telling.
This was a clean cut, obviously a sharp instrument like a knife or a razor had been used. There was no hemorrhage or bleeding into the soft tissues. That told me that these were post-mortem injuries. And from that information, it became apparent that somebody was trying to obscure her identity.
By going to such great lengths to hide the victim's identity, investigators were confident the killer was someone close to her. They went to Irma's residence to search for answers. On a section of vinyl flooring in Irma's kitchen, investigators found reddish-brown stains that appeared to be blood. A plastic bag recovered from underneath the sink also looked blood-stained. Convinced they had found the murder scene, investigators continued searching for evidence of homicide. On the table, they noticed an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The ends of the filters were flattened, just like the one recovered from the crime scene.
Small bag?
I had observed an ashtray that had a lot of cigarette butts in it with a real distinctive bite mark on them. I questioned the family about these cigarette butts, and they advised that that was their father's cigarette butts, that he had a real distinctive way he bit on the filter.
Now, detectives wanted to speak to Irma's son, Henderson Williams. When they arrived at his home, he wasn't there. As they prepared to leave, investigators noticed a woman leaving the trailer on Henderson's property.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I talk to you for a second?
She identified herself as Brenda Rowell. She rented the trailer from Henderson Williams. Though she stated that she and Henderson were close, she was unaware that Irma had been murdered. Investigators sensed that the news made Brenda uneasy. They asked her to accompany them to the Mobile County Sheriff's Department to answer more questions.
She'll be back in no time. Okay?
You know, it's short notice and everything, and
Detectives asked Brenda if she'd seen anything unusual at Henderson's place recently.
Can I ask you a couple questions, okay?
Yeah, he was arguing a lot with
She mentioned seeing Henderson washing his car the day before.
There's a lot of fighting going on.
He'd scrubbed it inside and out, even the trunk. Brenda thought it was odd that Henderson would suddenly take such pride in the old car's appearance.
Okay, Brenda, I'm asking you.
Investigators showed her a picture of the tire jack recovered from Irma's body.
Yes.
Brenda was surprised. It looked like hers.
You gave him that jack?
She said she had lent it to Henderson recently, but he had not returned it. Investigators turned their focus toward Henderson's relationship with his mother.
She's a very sweet lady. Arguing a lot.
Brenda said that Henderson and Irma had been arguing over money from his father's estate.
Nope, just needed it.
Irma felt her son was greedy and lazy and decided to cut him out of her will and denied him access to money left to her by his father. Henderson became irate.
Don't worry about this one.
In fact, Brenda admitted that a few weeks back, she and Henderson had a bitter argument.
I need you to sign the check. Sign?
No, I don't like doing this. I don't want to be.
Henderson wanted her to sign Irma's name on checks he had taken from his mother.
Sit down. I need you to fill a check.
Brenda was reluctant to do it, but Henderson threatened to evict her from the trailer if she didn't. She felt she had no choice. She forged Irma's name on the checks.
Don't worry about it.
For detectives, a motive for murder was beginning to take shape.
Okay, I'll be right there.
And Henderson Williams was now the prime suspect in the death of his mother. Now, investigators needed to prove it. To corroborate Brenda Rowell's story, detectives contacted the manager of Irma's bank. Not only did she confirm Brenda's account, she said that just before Irma's death, Irma had filed forgery charges against her son. Though the information didn't prove murder, it was enough for investigators to obtain a search warrant for Henderson's property.
I appreciate it.
Police waited until Henderson was away from his residence before executing the warrant. An inspection of Henderson's vehicle revealed the presence of small reddish stains on a rear taillight and larger stains on the trunk's carpet. All of the samples were collected and sent to the state crime lab for further analysis. Investigators also took inked impressions of the car's tires to compare to those recovered at the pond. As the search of Henderson's property continued, investigators located the burn pile described earlier by Sharon Williams. Sifting through the rubble, they found several small bone fragments. Mindful that the victim's hands had been removed and never found, investigators collected the remains. All of the evidence was pointing to Henderson Williams as the killer. But until investigators could physically link him to the murder, he would remain a free man. Police in Alabama and Mississippi struggled to solve the murder of 85-year-old Irma Williams, found floating in a local fishing pond. Though the circumstantial evidence pointed to her son, Henderson Williams, as the killer, investigators had no physical evidence tying him to the murder. Items collected from a search of Henderson's property were sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science. Medical examiner Dr. J.C. Upshaw Downs started with bone fragments found in the burn pile.
We were concerned at the time, since her hands had been removed, that those potentially could have been bones from Ms. Williams' hands. So they were examined by our anthropologist and also examined for DNA in order to determine if they were human, and if they were human, were they Ms. Williams. It turned out that they were non-human remains.
Still, examiners had other items recovered from Henderson's property. Serologist Elaine Scott analyzed stains taken from the trunk liner of Henderson's vehicle to determine if they were of human origin. Tetramethylbenzidine, a chemical that reacts to protein in human blood by turning it blue, is applied to the swabs. The initial screening confirmed the stains found in Henderson's trunk were human blood. Scott then repeated the process on the stains found on items from the victim's kitchen. They too were of human origin. Now, examiners needed to determine the source of the blood. DNA testing was performed on all of the samples. After extracting and isolating specific genetic characteristics in each sample, examiners determined the blood found in the victim's kitchen was genetically consistent with the blood found in Henderson's car. When those results were compared to DNA samples taken from Irma Williams at autopsy, the results were indisputable.
The blood stains in this case were at the house and placed the victim bleeding in the house, and also they placed the victim bleeding on the car.
Though the evidence was powerful, it was not ironclad. To make their case, investigators needed to physically link Henderson Williams to the crime scene. And there was one piece of evidence that had to be tested. The cigarette butt found at the pond. With only microscopic traces of saliva to work with, examiners determined there was sufficient DNA in the cigarette butt to perform the analysis. Elaine Scott then compared those results to DNA taken from other cigarette butts known to be Henderson's.
The saliva did give us a DNA profile that matched to Mr. Williams, indicating that he had smoked the cigarette at the crime scene.
The information was enough to arrest Henderson Williams for the murder of his 85-year-old mother.
Step out here, please. Listen to this, officer.
In custody, Henderson maintained his innocence, claiming he hadn't been near the pond in recent days. But all of the forensic evidence suggested otherwise.
Okay.
Investigators had matched the tire tread impression recovered at the scene to a tire on Henderson's car.
These officers, please, will tell you what to do.
Police believe that Henderson Williams' anger raged out of control when his mother cut him off from his father's estate. Investigators believe that Henderson Williams went to his mother's home, where he beat her to death. He then removed her hands, hoping to prevent identification, then placed her body in the pond. In April 1996, Henderson Williams stood trial for the murder of his mother, Irma Williams.
This was right there in front of your house. This was in your car.
He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
Mr. Williams?
In Alabama, there was no doubt that a woman pulled from a small pond had been murdered. But in Texas, police would have to wade through the evidence to determine whether a woman's death was an accident or murder. In this story, some of the names have been changed. Fort Worth, Texas, May 3, 1987. Francis and Jesus de la Rosa were settling in for the evening when they heard screams outside their suburban home.
Somebody out there.
A man, soaking wet and distraught, stumbled inside.
What's going on? My girlfriend. Your girlfriend?
He pleaded for them to call 911.
Call the police.
He said his car had been swept away in a flash flood and his girlfriend was missing. The Fort Worth Fire Department's swift water rescue team received the call. For them, These emergencies were becoming all too familiar. Torrential rains had pounded the Fort Worth area during the previous month, destroying property and worse. According to Fire Captain Richard Ward, many people had lost their lives while attempting to drive through flash floods.
The people are on their way to wherever, and they decide to try to cross the water or cross the road where the water's going, and they get swept downstream because just looking at it, they can't tell how deep the water is, and they always underestimate how powerful the water is.
This night, 2 people had made that mistake, and now one of them was missing. The rescue team searched the area near the bridge crossing where the car had been swept away. Divers scoured below the creek surface for any signs of the missing woman or the vehicle. But after several hours of exhaustive searching, rescuers found nothing. As the search continued, police questioned the driver, 40-year-old Domingo Turo, a Cuban immigrant who spoke broken English. Turo told police he had tried to drive through the water on the road. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed Turo's statement.
He didn't realize how swift the water was. He tried to back up, and it was too late. It started washing him off into the creek, and that he tried to get out and was in fact able to, he and the victim both, to get out of the car.
Turo told police that he grabbed his girlfriend, 20-year-old Janice Walters, as the car filled with water and went tumbling downstream in the currents. But the raging water broke his grasp, and she was lost. As the floodwaters began to recede several hours later, searchers were finally able to locate Turo's car. It was carried more than a mile from the crossing before being washed up on an embankment. Police retrieved the vehicle, but there was no sign of Janice Walters.
We performed a search around the vehicle, thinking that she might have stayed close to the vehicle whenever it was swept off the roadway. Our search around the vehicle and in the vehicle didn't turn up anything.
Rescuers continued looking for her, but with each passing hour, hopes of finding her unharmed grew dimmer. The search continued into the following day. Around noon, searchers discovered a body washed up on the shoreline. The woman matched Janice's description. The lifeless body, nude except for a small chain necklace, was found 1.5 miles from the spot where the vehicle had been swept away. It seemed that the violent Texas storms had claimed another life. Rescue workers in Fort Worth, Texas, believed that they had recovered the body of 20-year-old Janice Walters, killed when the car she and her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, were driving, got swept away in a flash flood. Authorities contacted Turo and Janice's sister, Kelly Hill, and asked them to identify the body. Kelly confirmed that her sister had been found. Investigators noticed that she seemed distant and cold toward Domingo Turo. In a statement taken later that day, Kelly confirmed that no one in her family was happy about Janice's relationship with Turo. Janice's body was transported to the Tarrant County morgue to undergo an autopsy. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Nizam Pirwani was immediately struck by the condition of the body.
One of the strange things that we discovered at the autopsy was that the body was totally nude, and And the story given to us was that she was wearing a blouse and a pair of blue jeans. In 20 years' time, I've never seen a case where the body has been totally disrobed.
And a necklace still clasped around the victim's neck had inexplicably remained intact, though there were numerous other injuries in the same area. Dr. Pirwani also noted the lack of telltale signs usually associated with drowning victims.
In most cases of drowning, one sees purging of frothy fluid, which is usually blood-tinged, and this comes out from the nostrils and the mouth. And it's also present in the trachea and the bronchioles. And this frothy fluid is due to admixing of air and water which is being inhaled in a person who is drowning. We didn't see such frothy fluid anywhere.
That meant there was no water in the victim's lungs. Janice Walters had not died of drowning. As Dr. Pirwani struggled to make sense of his findings, he examined injuries found on the victim's neck. He noticed what appeared to be curvilinear abrasions, injuries typically caused by a victim's fingernails in a struggle to break a stranglehold. None of Janice's injuries were consistent with a drowning death. Dr. Pirwani stopped the examination and contacted Fort Worth police. He wanted to be certain that he had not misunderstood the circumstances surrounding Janice's death. But investigators had no reason to believe that her death was anything but a tragic accident. And the tragedy didn't end with Janice's death alone. As Dr. Pirwani proceeded with the internal examination, he discovered that she was in the early stages of pregnancy. The examination held one last surprise. There were deep hemorrhages of the muscles in the victim's neck. For Dr. Pirwani, there was only one way to explain all of the injuries.
We were not able to show any water in the lung, no frothy fluid, no blood-tinged fluid in the trachea or the bronchial tree. So the negative findings of lungs as well as the positive findings of the neck were consistent with the manual strangulation.
Dr. Pirwani's routine post-mortem examination had uncovered a homicide. After reviewing the autopsy results, Detective Mike Garvin wanted to speak with Janice's boyfriend, Domingo Turo. To overcome any confusion caused by the language barrier, he enlisted a translator for the interview. Turo claimed that recently his relationship with Janice had been rocky. But on the night she died, they had reconciled and were looking forward to starting over. He said he and Janice were returning from dinner shortly after 9 p.m. He started crossing the low-water bridge when a flash flood swept the car into the creek. He struggled to keep the car from being swept downstream. But as the car began to fill with water, he panicked and stated he may have grabbed Janice by the neck to keep her from drowning. But ultimately, the powerful currents tore them apart and she was lost. If Turo had grabbed Janice by the neck, it seemed unlikely that the thin gold chain necklace would have remained intact. Dr. Pirwani's findings, coupled with Turo's statements, led investigators to suspect that he had murdered Janice Walters. But so far, they had no real physical evidence to prove it.
Get the landmarks in.
Investigators in Fort Worth, Texas, believe that the death of 20-year-old Janice Walters was a deliberate act of murder.
Yes, ma'am, we will.
And her boyfriend, Domingo Turo, was the prime suspect. but police had little physical evidence and no motive to make their case. Detective Mike Garvin reviewed statements made by Janice's sister, Kelly Hill. Kelly described Janice as a warm young woman, full of fun, who'd always been very close to her family. She was excited at the prospect of being a mother. But Turo, the father of the unborn child, had become abusive and didn't want the responsibilities that came with having a baby. For the sake of her unborn child, Janice had no choice but to end the relationship with Turo. She moved home to be with her family. But Kelly stated that Turo refused to let her out of his life. A few days before Janice died, Turo called the house and they argued bitterly.
I know you are still thinking.
Kelly stated she listened to the conversation on another extension. Turo threatened to kill Janice if she left him.
You will be sorry if you leave. I am telling.
Convinced that Turo had followed through on his threat, investigators still needed proof. They pored over Turo's statement, looking for any clue they may have overlooked. They found one. Turo said that he and Janice were returning from dinner when they were caught in the flash flood. Looking over maps of the area, detectives realized the couple had been heading in the wrong direction on a dead-end street. Paul Dixon, Assistant District Attorney for Tarrant County, explains the importance of the discovery.
The neighborhood used that dead-end area as sort of an illegal dumping ground. Old mattresses, old tires, trash, that sort of thing. The police had informed us that from time to time, a body would be recovered from that place.
For investigators, it was now clear that Turo was on his way to the dump to dispose of Janice's body. With his story discredited, detectives now had enough evidence to arrest Domingo Turo for the capital murder of Janice Walters. Police believe that when Janice returned to Turo's home to pick up her belongings, his possessiveness, inflamed by Janice's rejection of him, exploded into violence.
You will stay here. No, you will.
After killing her, he removed her clothes and then tried to hide her body, along with any trace of the crime.
He was traveling across the low-water bridge, through the rainstorm, through the flood, and nature intervened and kept him from getting to his goal.
Domingo Turo was tried and convicted for the murder of Janice Walters. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison.
Forensic science was very important because without Dr. Pirwani being able to do the autopsy and prove that it was a strangulation, we wouldn't have had a case, even though no matter how much the family thought probably that he had done something foul, we would have had no proof of it at all.
In Texas, forensic science exposed a murderer who tried to submerge evidence of his crime in a flash flood. But in Wisconsin, it took an attentive forensic pathologist to recognize a homicide disguised as an accident. Berlin, Wisconsin, August 22, 1990. A blasting company employee was locking up for the day when he heard someone screaming for help. A man, covered in mud, said he'd just been in a car accident and his ex-wife was unconscious.
Okay, all right.
After calling 911, the two rushed back to the scene. Within minutes, the Green Lake County Sheriff's Department and Berlin Emergency Medical Units arrived. They found a white car in a water-filled ditch, resting against a muddy embankment.
Come on, get one of you guys in here. Let's go.
A woman, face down in the ditch, was pulled from the water.
Okay,
Emergency technicians who rushed to her aid discovered that she wasn't breathing. They immediately began critical life-saving procedures, including CPR, to resuscitate her. The efforts paid off. The victim began breathing on her own. Barely clinging to life, she was rushed to the hospital. As the ambulance pulled away, police took a brief statement from the other accident victim. He identified himself as Daniel Egan and the woman as his ex-wife, Darlene. He said she'd swerved suddenly to avoid a deer, and the car plunged into the ditch. Egan told deputies he'd gone for help and returned to find Darlene face down in the water. Darlene was taken to the emergency room at Berlin Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. A Green Lake County deputy met Darlene's family at the hospital. As he was explaining details of the accident, a doctor came and told them Darlene had not survived her injuries. The family was devastated by the news, and they couldn't understand why Darlene was with her ex-husband. Sheriff's Deputy Ron Click explains.
When I informed them that Dan Egan was a passenger in the vehicle when it had gone off the roadway, the family indicated to me that because of the rather stormy relationship that they had, that it wasn't likely that she would allow Dan Egan to be in her vehicle.
The deputy contacted investigators at the scene and passed along the information. Wisconsin state troopers began their routine accident reconstruction. By measuring the angle and dimensions of the tire marks left on the road, investigators estimated that the car had been traveling at approximately 49 miles per hour, slightly under the speed limit.
Okay.
But the marks left on the pavement were not the result of braking.
Over there?
They were the result of a deliberate, high-speed turn. According to State Trooper Dennis McConnell, that fact was unusual.
An operator in a vehicle faced with a hazard such as a deer, almost 99% of the time, the first driver reaction to that hazard is to step on the brakes. And there was no indication of braking whatsoever.
The findings were enough for investigators to request that a thorough forensic examination be performed on the vehicle. The car was towed to the police impound lot. The hospital pathologist performed an autopsy on Darlene Egan. From the amount of water in her lungs, the official cause of death was ruled a drowning. But something about the victim's condition was troubling. There was an excessive amount of mud found under her eyes and in her nose and ears. The coroner requested that Darlene Egan's body be re-examined by a forensic pathologist. That evening, evidence technicians began processing the vehicle for clues. They noted the condition of the seatbelt. It was stretched over the steering wheel, still in the buckled position. Technicians also observed a lot of mud plastered on the front of the car. That wasn't unusual, but a closer inspection of the bumper revealed a hair embedded in the mud. Not knowing its significance, the hair was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. Examiners would later determine that the hair did not belong to Darlene Egan. Investigators interviewed Dan Egan the following day.
Yeah, sure.
They wanted a moment-by-moment account of the accident. Dan said he and Darlene were going to his mother's house to pick up their 2 children when the accident occurred. Egan told police his ex-wife suddenly yelled, "Deer," and swerved hard to the right off the road. The next thing he remembered was the car in the water-filled ditch. Darlene was unresponsive and slumped against the driver's door. Egan said he climbed out of the car and ran to the blasting company for help. He returned to the scene within a few minutes. He couldn't explain how Darlene ended up face down in the ditch. Maybe she'd come to, struggled out of the car, then lost consciousness again. For Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigations agent Rick Lewell, the amount of time necessary for that scenario was at odds with the facts.
We soon realized that there wasn't enough time involved for him to get out of the car, to run and get help, for her to get out of the car, for her to fall in the water and drown before he returned to the scene. So it wasn't passing the smell test. Something stunk here, something was wrong. We had to take a lot deeper look at this entire accident.
For investigators, the circumstances surrounding Darlene Egan's tragic death were raising too many questions. They hoped the forensic pathologist could give them answers. Police in Wisconsin investigating the drowning death of Darlene Egan, killed after the car she and her ex-husband Dan were driving crashed into a ditch, suspected foul play. And Dan Egan's statements to police weren't adding up. To find answers, detectives enlisted a forensic pathologist to conduct a second autopsy. Dr. Robert Huntington III, a forensic pathologist for the state of Wisconsin, was given the assignment.
When we do a forensic autopsy, we've got 3 ends in view. We want to see if we can determine a cause of death. We want to see if we can rule out other causes of death, and we want to see if that body itself can tell us anything about how that death arrived to that body.
The pathologist agreed with the original cause of death listed as drowning. But the injuries noted during the examination appeared inconsistent with injuries caused by a car crash. They looked like something else.
When we get bodies out of a motor vehicle crash, they are definitely banged up. And she wasn't that banged up. And the really disturbing feature were scratches on and around the face. Now, yes, you can get scratches in a car crash, but some of these had a semblance to fingernail, enough to worry you.
The presence of fingernail scratches found on the victim's head suggested the car crash hadn't caused the drowning. In the final analysis, Dr. Huntington believed that Darlene Egan had been murdered.
Now, suppose somebody was holding her head under the water. Now, that might explain fingernail marks and such like that.
Dr. Huntington's analysis gave investigators insight into how Darlene Egan died. But to make a murder case against her ex-husband, they now needed to find a motive. They turned to the victim's family for answers. Her sister, Denise Krause, told police that Darlene divorced Dan Egan in 1988 after 5 years of marriage. Dan had become physically abusive, and Darlene lived in constant fear of him. But she was putting her life back together. Darlene had recently taken a job as a state police dispatcher and was a devoted mother to her 2 daughters. She had also become engaged to a police officer. Denise added that Darlene and Dan had been involved in a vicious custody battle up until the day before Darlene's death. As the elements of a motive began falling into place, police contacted Darlene's attorney in the custody dispute.
Yes, I need to talk to you
She
about
told
a report
investigators
here.
that Darlene had been granted primary custody of the children.
Southwest Correctional Center? Yes. With Jeff here?
And she
Yes.
confirmed that the ruling came down the day before the accident.
I want to take this opportunity to let you know my recommendation.
In fact, she had met with the couple to discuss the arrangements.
It is my recommendation that Mrs. Egan have full custody of
When told of the court's ruling, Dan became irate. He also resented having to pay child support. He vowed to keep his children no matter what. Armed with this information, investigators went back to question Dan Egan. But this time as the prime suspect in his ex-wife's murder.
Mr. Egan, we need to get some...
Knowing Darlene took great pains to avoid being alone with Dan Egan, investigators wanted to know how the two ended up in Darlene's car together. Dan stated that on the day of the accident, Darlene came by his home to pick up the kids. But Dan's mother had taken the kids that day and was unable to bring them back to his house. And Dan didn't have a car to go get them himself. He admitted that Darlene was upset when she arrived and learned she'd have to pick the children up at his mother's. Darlene and Dan's mother didn't get along, so according to Dan, she asked him to go with her. He claimed that's where they were going when the accident occurred. Before they left, Egan agreed to provide investigators with a hair sample. The hair was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Dan Egan's hair was compared to the hair found on the bumper of Darlene's car. They matched. For investigators, there seemed to be only one explanation for how his hair ended up on the bumper. And that explanation was consistent with the excessive amount of mud noted on the victim's face during autopsy.
Darlene may have pulled hair from her ex-husband while she's fighting to keep from being pushed under the water. And if she did have a handful of his head hair and she's pushed under the car, she would then grab the undercarriage of the car and try and free herself to get out from underneath the water. And in doing so, she would have transferred his head hair to the undercarriage of that car.
As Darlene struggled to save her own life, she left behind proof of murder. Investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Dan Egan for the murder of his ex-wife. Based on the evidence, police believe that as the couple drove down the road, Dan wrenched the wheel to the right, sending the car into the ditch. Darlene, still buckled into the driver's seat, was ripped from the car. In the struggle, Darlene grabbed Dan by the hair, but he finally overpowered her, forcibly holding her head underwater until she drowned. For the first-degree murder of his ex-wife, Dan Egan was sentenced to life in prison. Once, killers could escape detection by washing away evidence of their crime. But today, advances in forensic science can bring proof of murder to the surface, even when the victims are dead in the water.